Hi, welcome back guys. This is your Sensei, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Naruto Got Harem in Elden Ring. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Could not be killed and they had tried was to be avoided at all costs. Perhaps that was why his kin avoided him so. An irritated grumble rumbled in the back of his head. Hypocrites. Better to kill them all. He shushed the alto familiar voice, shifted a little atop the stone bench that held him, and scratched another entry in his journal. Not yet, Kurama. You know why? The fox subsided with a tired grumble and let him be, so too did Godric let the sights and sounds of the gardens wash over him. There were many such seats here in Marika's gardens, though few of them were occupied at this hour. That was not to say the gardens themselves were abandoned, of course. They were not. This was Leyndell after all. Pages bustled to and fro with their missives. Nobles plodded in the shadows. Steadfast knights patrolled on a rota, marching a meandering path that led them his way once every 3 cycles, the steady clomp of their boots a constant comfort to his ears. To a one they all ignored him, acting as though he didn't exist. He caught a glimpse of Miquella and Maelnia some distance away, deeper in the garden, and waved their way. The former didn't even deign to look at him, not that she could with those rot-scarred eyes of hers. They didn't harass him as some did, but neither did they help him either. He had tried to spar with Maelnia once. She'd beaten him so badly he'd needed a week to fully recover. Are you truly this weak? Needless to say, he'd not asked again. Kurama wanted her head on a spike to this day. Miquella wasn't much better, but speaking with him seemed to make Maelnia all the more brutal. He tended to refrain from that these days. Radon was nice to him, even spoke kindly to him on occasion, but he was seldom in the capital these days. His place was in Caelid, and his kindness a distant memory. Godwyn, his supposed ancestor, spent much time below the capital. Few saw him these days. Ranuel. She seldom spoke to anyone, and the less said about her the better. Others were more open in their aggression. A hand wrapped around the back of his hand. Care for a swim, cousin? Naruto closed his journal with a small smile and set it aside where he knew it wouldn't get wet. Why not? He closed his eyes. It's a hot day. The grip on his head tightened, fingernails digging into his scalp. Wrong answer, little Godric. This from the little fool himself. He could carve him into bloody pieces well before he could react. Kurama wanted to, but he wouldn't. Not yet. A snarl was his only warning, his only chance to fill his lungs with air before his head plunged underwater. It really did feel quite nice. Really, when were they going to learn? He wasn't going to drown, no matter how many times. They dunked his head under not when he could hold his breath for as long as he liked. They shoved his head underwater again. Naruto blew bubbles in a sigh. 9 years old and he had grown accustomed to such treatment. Trying to drown him was the lightest crime. The words, the whippings, the beatings when he failed to meet their expectations, it was part and parcel of his life these days. They wanted him to fight back, derived pleasure from his struggle. Likewise, they lost interest when he didn't. He would not give them the satisfaction they sought. Sure enough, his tormentor gave up after a minute when he didn't move. Naruto pried himself upright, pushing up off the fountain, and ran a hand across his face. Thanks. I needed that. Praetor Rykard leered back at him. Don't look at me with that insipid smile, you cursed thing. Naruto tossed his head side to side, wringing water out his long, silver hair. Why ever not? Did I do something wrong? Yes, they were trying to get a rise out of him. A reaction. Pity they'd never get it. A normal boy might have given in to them. He wouldn't. Not yet. He would remember every slight. Every instance. Every grudge. Every blow that ever landed, and one day he would repay then tenfold. Rykard scowled his way. Accursed creature. Naruto only smiled. He knew it unnerved him just like the others. Is that all you can do? An open palm sent his world spinning to the left. Just smile and take it. He struck the floor, pain blooming in his cheek. What's wrong? Another blow rocked his world. You're a descendant of Godwyn, aren't you? I expected more. His head cracked against an upturned stone and for a moment, just a moment, he lost his temper. Fury slipped its leash and Kurama seized it with all the ire of a wrathful god. Blue eyes bled red, the whites of his eyes boiling black with a single thought, a singular longing, a burst of killing intent so potent that the outcome was never in question: die. Rykard pitched back with a frightened yelp, clutching his teeth. He perished before he hit the cobblestones. Naruto righted himself with a sigh. Really, Kurama. They had, quite literally, scared him to death. I regret nothing. He had it coming. A quick blink was all it took to rein his tempestuous temper in. It was tempting to leave Rykard that way, to let destined death have him, but no. Killing a demigod here would draw attention to himself, and attention was the last thing he needed. Even now he ran the risk of discovery. The last thing he needed was one of his cousins stumbling upon them like this. With a long-suffering sigh, he laid a hand on Rykard's head, reached in, and took hold of his memories. Psychic fingers wrapped around one in particular, the memory of his death, and wiped it away. Rykard's heart restarted under his touch a moment later, and his so-called cousin floundered upright with a gasp. What was that? Naruto granted him a benign, innocent smile. You must have tripped. Yes, of course. The little fool was all too eager to believe it, for to think otherwise meant this weak boy wasn't weak at all. Stop staring at me. Naruto most assuredly did not. Are we done? The Inquisitor snarled and called a smoldering magma hex to his open palm, bathing his face in baleful light. Arrogant little twat. I said stop staring at me. Mongrel, a gloved hand seized his wrist, wrenched it down, around, then behind his back entirely. His spell sputtered out to splash harmlessly against the dirt. Mongrel, is he? A familiar voice cooed with limpid sincerity. I would have you take back those words, my lord. Naruto palmed his face with a rueful sigh. Maria, I have this under control. She ignored him. Do you enjoy tormenting my lord, good sir? Freaks, the both of you. Rykard tore his limb free and hissed like the cold serpent he was on the inside. The Golden Order would do well to be rid of the. A flash of long, flowing red hair danced across his vision. That is not for you to decide, dear brother. Naruto looked up, a rare FL curve of surprise overtaking his sarcastic smile. Run. And now the witch comes. Lovely. What does she want this time? Rykard zigged his tongue, not fancying his chances now that they outnumbered him. Even you defend him, sister. Is this how you wish to spend what time you have left? When she didn't answer him, he growled and turned away. Enough. I grow weary of this. Bright eyes glared golden daggers at him, colder than the night sky itself. Then leave us. You know what need be done. I shall do it. Remarkably, the so-called praetor did just that, departing with all due haste. There had been Maria, could you fetch me some clean clothes for him? His aide nodded and marched off. Runny looked like she wanted to say something more but held her tongue. Even she had that instinctive revulsion of him. Everyone did. Such was what it meant to be blessed by destined death. It came as something of a surprise then, when shook her head, setting her scarlet hair swaying, and bent to dry his face with a clean cloth. Must you antagonize him like that? Didn't say anything. He grunted as she ran the handkerchief a little Toroora over his nose. He ambushed me again. Her gaze searched his, found not a hint of a lie. Stay in your chambers tonight. That was out of the blue. All right. She pinched his cheek. I mean it, little Godric. There was something in her voice just then. He didn't like it. Something told him asking wouldn't bring him any answers, however, and so he held his tongue. Promise me. She gave him a firm look. I would have your word. He shrugged. But I promise. Swear it or I shall cast a spell on you to make it so fine. He held up his pinky finger and hooked it in hers. I swear I won't go out tonight, no matter what I hear or see. Good. She drew him into a warm embrace, startling him all the more, if only because she usually eschewed physical contact. You are so much more than you know. Her chin came down on his shoulder as she pulled him closer till, almost clinging to him. Whatever comes next, whatever happens, do not let them snuff you out, cousin. You make it sound like you're leaving. Her arms tightened around him that much more. In a sense. I wish you good fortune in all that is to come. That night, Godric slept. Through the screams and the chaos and the noise. Through the clash of steel and rasps of destined death. through the horror that would one day be known Night of the Black Knives. And he woke to a world changed. You disgrace us all, Godric. As far as insults went, Marika knew it was a scathing one, just the sort a child should never hear. It was meant to break him, cinder his spirit, reduce him to a quivering wreck at her feet. Her hammer should have done that already. Her words would certainly be the finishing blow. It did none of these things. The boy took the insult with good grace, just as he always did. He did not flinch. He did not cry. He only smiled at her and healed his wounds, set his broken bones. In that at least he had Godwin's BLD. He was a failure in every other aspect, but he never cried, never complained, never once raised his voice. He always healed eventually. I'm sorry. He still sounded like he meant it even after 9 years. I'll do better next time. No, you won't. She snapped. Yes, his smile didn't waver, not once. I will. Her hand cracked across his face, snapping his head to the side. Still he smiled. Marika hated that smile. It reminded her of Godfrey, of Godwin, freshly lost to the Night of Black Knives. The runt before her was barely even a demigod by BLD. His silver hair reflected such silver. Not the gold of her fallen firstborn nor the white of her husband, but some mad blend between the two. It made her loathe him all the more. She hated him, hated that the Two Fingers had chosen him, named him Empyrean in the wake of Godwin's death. How she loathed him. But it should have been him. He should have died. Why had Runni and Godwin perished while he yet lives? 'Twas not fair. Would she never be rid of this blasted boy? What must she do to be rid of him? This wretched runt carried destined death's blessing with him wherever he went, and she wanted no part of it, no, nay, never. She wanted him gone, away, far, far away. An idea dawned. In her demented spite, Marika latched onto it. You right, little Godric. He perked up. I am. Indeed. She didn't deign to conceal her smile. You will be better. I shall grant you Stormvale Castle as your domain. Far, far from the capital, far from her, out of sight and out of mind. It has fallen into disrepair hence, but I am certain you can make it your own in due time. You shall leave with your servants on the morrow. His smile thinned. With no resources. I shall give you a wagon and a company of knights. The better to make sure he did not return to Landel. Now be gone from my sight. Godric's smile yet remained. He couldn't even do that, not with his broken legs. In the end it was she who departed, leaving him to suffer in the dark. Godric lay there, watching, waiting. Kurama sighed in his head once he was certain she'd gone. You sure about this? Naruto blew out a sigh. I am. They all hate you. Why bother? Most, he grunted, setting his legs with an audible crack. But not all. They really do. His old friend remained steadfast. Melnia and Miquella. Even Rykard would rather not be seen with you or what you carry. I'm not sure if they fear us more, or destined death. To say nothing of Radagon and Marika, he held up a hand, smiling still as his wrist snapped back into place with a horrible crack. Radon and Runni are. One good apple does not an orchard make you know what happened to Runni. She died. He chortled a little. Did she though? You know something. I suspect. He propped himself up with a rusty laugh. Blade and IG were awfully quick to vanish after her death. It's almost as if they were ready for it. Her heard the faint sound of onrushing footsteps and paused. Well, at least he had one true ally in this place. She rounded the corner in a swirl of dark silk. Saw him. Gasped. My lord, he waved his servant aside as she knelt before him. Fine, Maria, you most assuredly are not. Bright eyes glared back at him, framed by ashen hair. You're covered in cuts and bruises. When he didn't protest, her face grew thunderous. I see. Marika did this to you, didn't she? What a wretched queen she is. You are her descendant, however distant. That she would hurt you, so he laughed and let her tend to him. Better she take her anger out on me than you. Oh, his laughter peaked when she pinched his cheek. All right. I'm sorry. I won't speak up like that again. I'll get stronger. You'll see. Marika and the rest could beat him down all they liked. He would always smile in the face of their cruelty. It would make the day he finally overthrew his new family all the sweeter. I'll come back here someday, and hell's coming with me. Shadows of glory, all was in readiness. Supplies had been packed. Provisions secured. An armored wagon was made ready for them pulled by 2 black stallions, and the grand doors of Lendl were even now being opened to speed them on their way. Rays of dappled sunlight poured through, mingling with the blessed light of the Erd tree to frame the golden plains beyond, almost as though the world itself were welcoming him with her bounty. Naruto closed his eyes to it all and took a deep breath to steady himself. His true journey began here. The world was his oyster now. He just had to reach out and grasp it. It should have been a somber affair, and perhaps it was to the nosy nobles and pages watching them from afar. After all, it wasn't every day a demigod was exiled from the capital. Let them watch and make their remarks. He cared not a jot for what they thought. They were ants to him, cruel and petty, locked in their own insular little world. Their thoughts didn't matter. Careful. That's the kind of thinking that led Madara down a dark path. Why should I care what they think? They hate me because Marika tells them to. They can't think for themselves. Bystanders aside, none of his so-called family had come to see them off. Naruto couldn't bring himself to be surprised. Not Marika or Radagon, nor the twins, and certainly not Rykard. He couldn't even blame Radon for his absence this time around. They were all of them in mourning. Godwin's death had shaken them. All, to say nothing of Rani if she was truly gone. Something about the circumstances of her demise nagged at him still. Now wasn't the time for such things. He'd dwell on it more when he reached Stormvale. Maria stepped up beside him, face carved from stone. I will be glad to leave this wretched place behind. That made 2 of them, and he had few fond memories of the capital. They might be starting anew, but it would be on their terms. His trusted bodyguard looked to him, daring a smile. Ready. He took a step toward the wagon. As I'll ever behold, boy. Naruto said that his tongue looked back with a sigh as a soft voice called out to him. Suppose it's too much to hope this would be a simple affair. Sure enough, they weren't alone. One of the finger maidens, yet another a pawn in service to the greater, will hasten their way at speed. Robed in white and gold, she moved with dignity and purpose, though her face lay hidden by a pale hooded veil. Naruto felt his lips curl into a small sardonic smile at the sight of her. He knew their kind, fickle as they were. He didn't recognize the 2 knights flanking her, however. Whomever they were, they looked ready for a fight. Was this going to turn into a slaughter after all? Before you depart, the robed maiden swept an arm out to her companions. We bring you gifts of the greater will. Maria tensed beside him, one hand straying to the hilt of her weapon. Naruto's brow furrowed. What manner of gifts? Those worthy of a prince. He caught the glimpse of a smile beneath the veil. Behold Swordmaster Oleg, she indicated the leftmost knight, a towering warrior clad in full plate, twin swords sheathed across his back. No one of the mortal realm can match his skill with a blade. Received a grim nod of the man's helm in return for her kind words, and mighty Engvil, another gesture to his companion on the right, champion of the arena. A faint grunt was her only reward. We grant you these warriors, 2 of the finest knights in all of Lendl, the better to shepherd you to Stormvale safely. So these were the SRT Marika had promised him. He'd expected more. You have my thanks and we grant you another, the finger maiden spoken over him. The knights parted in lockstep, revealing a 4th figure. Naruto's throat closed as found himself presented with a willowy young woman clad in a white dress. Her pale skin almost seemed to gleam in the early morning light. She too wore a hooded veil, though she now lifted it to reveal herself while he looked on. Strange scale-like markings shaded bright blue eyes, framed by dark green hair and a tiny tremulous smile. And yet there was something strange about her. The longer he looked at this odd girl, the more certain he became. She wasn't entirely human. Even her bare feet bore some tiny semblance of scales, and belatedly, as he looked past them, he realized she possessed a tail not unlike that of a dragon. Oishi. Her name is Yorshika. The maiden replied. She is to be thy shadow. Naruto felt his heart skip a beat. Right, he'd been declared an Empyrean just last night. Maria stiffened behind him, eyes narrowing to thin, angry slits. I am his guard. He has no need for such. Yet you are no shadow girl. The maiden glanced at her askance and dismissed her immediately. Your lord hath been declared an Empyrean, middling though his BLD may be. Ah yes, how very kind of her to remind him of his weakness. Each and every Empyrean must have a shadow. And so she is his. Greetings, my lord. The girl bowed her head and curtsied feebly. If I can provide thee succor, you need only tell me how. Maria's hand strayed to her twin blades. Oh dear. What? Naruto swallowed once to clear his throat, then looked back to her. Why give her to me now? Each and every Empyrean received their shadow from Bia. He knew this for a fact. They grew up with them, lived with them, cherished them. Runt did as had Godwin, though his had unfortunately fallen with him on the night of Black Knives. Even Miquela and Maelnia were since granted shadows of their own shortly after they came into the world, or so he'd been told. This was done to foster friendship between each Empyrean and shadow, to better bind them to one another. Yet they were only giving Yoshika to him mere moments before his departure. It smacked of an insult another to avenge. Because now you are worthy. The maiden said simply. We wish thee good fortune in all things to come. The words reminded of Runt and he shivered a little. The gift, she said. He knew what this was, the truth of it. Yoshika was no gift. Just another leash to bind him to the Golden Order, to the greater will. A well-crafted leash perhaps, and not at all aware of her purpose, but a leash still. She would turn on him against her own will if need be and try to kill him should he ever move against the order. He pitied her plight, but to take her with them was folly, even if he bore her no ill will. Yet neither could he turn her away without revealing his hand. Refusing a gift from the fingers would only draw their ire and their suspicion. We're going to bring her with us, aren't we? They had little choice in the matter. Come along. She bowed. As you will, Sir Godric. Maria made a strangled noise caught somewhere between a snarl and a hiss. Naruto palmed his face to stifle a sigh. None of that from you, I only just got her to stop calling me that. Her bow deepened, much to Maria's expressed displeasure. Your wish is my command. Then I wish for us to leave. His smile was decidedly strained. Get in the wagon. Yoshika didn't need to be told twice. Maria followed her with a sour expression and after a moment's pause, Oleg and Engvall moved to flank the vehicle on either side. Those certainly were a silent lot if nothing else. Hopefully they wouldn't try to stab him in the back the moment they were out the gates. Naruto moved to join them and reached for the reins. The Finger Maiden's voice tugged at him before he could. I bear a message from the greater will. A final gift to thee before ye begin your journey. There was no one to pretend for here, and so he rolled his eyes. Call it what it is. This is exile. The face behind the veil didn't waver. Even so, I must deliver my message. He waved her on. Speak then. As you wish. The Finger Maiden tugged back her cowl to reveal her face in its entirety. Bright eyes shone like golden stars from a lovely face framed by raven black hair and a faint smile. Younger than he expected too. Much younger. Despite her height she was little more than a girl herself and only a few years older than him. She knelt with eerie grace, bringing herself level with him for a fleeting moment until her forehead touched his. Heed my words, you who bear destined death, a piece of mine self. Her voice reverberated with otherworldly splendor and he felt Kurama bridle within him as that alien presence touched their minds. Your mother may shun you, but I shall not. I know the truth of what you are. Seek the bounty beneath storm veil and you shall prosper. 1. I have spoken. Warm lips alighted upon his forehead, drawing an angry hiss from Maria in the carriage and linger for a heartbeat. She drew back, eyes sparkling, and considered him for a long moment. Fare thee well and may we meet again. The glamour faded from her eyes and hair, leaving only the vessel behind. So may it be. The Finger Maiden bowed. The greater will has spoken. My part in this is done. Now wait just a second. He made a blonde grab for her sleeve, only for his hand to pass right through the garment like so much air. Naruto jerked back and balked at his hand. That was all the time the maiden needed. She stood soundlessly and slipped away into the morning mists, vanishing back from whence she'd come. Did we just talk to a god? Goddess. Kurama corrected him gruffly. Ain't no way that thing's male. Well, that was mildly concerning now, wasn't it? You're sure? Might have been a fluke, you know, after that display. I'd bet all my tails on it. Honestly, you always attract the most troublesome things. The journey to Stormvale was made in stoic silence. No one said a word when the gates closed behind them. No sound was given as they left the golden plains of the Altus Plateau behind. No noise made save for the tromping of Oleg and Engvel's boots alongside the rolling wheels of the carriage. Maria and Yorshka spoke little and ate even less as they trundled on. Naruto found it wasn't even a terribly good carriage at that. Blasted thing had an awful squeaky wheel and rattled something fierce. The horses, at least, were of decent stock, and thanks to them they made good time. They steered well clear of Mtgelmir and the Volcano Manor, having no wish to intrude upon Rykard's domain and test his temper. Likewise the lakes of Liurnia were avoided. Renala had gone mad long ago. Rumor had it she'd been sealed in the library by her advisors to prevent yet further damage, and so they skirted the academy well. They dare not rest near the road for fear of bandits and brigands, and so on they rode. On and on they went, until at last, they reached Limgrave and he saw Stormvale in the distance. It lived up to its namesake, but little else. Shrouded by storm though it was, it did little to conceal the castle's disrepair. Even from here his keen eyes saw much. Likewise he could see the crumbling walls and broken gate, as though some mighty beast had tried to climb over the castle, given up halfway and simply smashed its way through. He had a bad feeling about this. Well, he sighed and squeezed the reins, Elter creaking in his grasp. This castle is gonna need a lot of work. Maria leaned over his shoulder. We shall make it our own then. Make what now? Yorshka poked her head out the carriage. And do you hear that? Naruto flked her a quizzical look. Hear what? That. She tilted her head. Listen. He did. Elo, a rich, resonant voice rang out, faded by distance, but notable nonetheless. I say, is anyone out there? Kurama hummed his appreciation. Well, your shadow has sharp ears, for a dragon girl. Naruto tugged back on the reins and brought the carriage to a grinding halt. Please, I am in need of aid there. Just over that hill and down the beaten path. He couldn't very well ignore that, could he? Stay with the carriage. I'll be right back. Yorshka sputtered. Maria bridled. Surely you jest. Oleg and Engvel grunted their disagreement as well. Fine. He heaved a sigh and cracked the reins. Together, let's have a look. Have a look they did, though what they found boggled the mind. It wasn't a man, or even a woman, but a large warrior jaw, trapped in the earth. It perked up upon seeing them and waved a spindly arm. Oh my stars, I'm so happy to see you. A man's voice issued from its hefty confines. Please, can you help me out of this pickle? Naruto stopped short, rather baffled himself. And you are? Alexander the Iron Fist, warrior jar, at your service. The jar tried to bow, then faltered when he realized he couldn't. Could I ask you for a bit of help? As you can see, I'm stuck here, poor guy. It shouldn't be too difficult, Alexander prattled happily. Just give me a good smack in the rear with something nice and big and I'll pop right out, I'm sure. The ladies flushed. Naruto choked. Even the knights couldn't quite restrain a chuckle. Best brace yourself. There's no need to fret, friend. Alexander waved him on. I can take it. He took a stance and pulled on the natural energy in the air. His eyes glowed gold, eyelids dusting over with the faintest tint of amber. Then he swung upward. True to form, the warrior jar popped right out with a rather startled yelp. Well played, good sir. He boomed a laugh and rubbed at his dented hide. Though that mighty wallop of yours almost spelled the end of me. So speaking, he sketched a grand bow. I thank you, and as a token of my appreciation, I'll give you a word of warning. He leaned close, as though to mime a whisper. Stay away from that castle over yonder. It's infested with all manner of beasts and foul ilk. Yorshka shivered a little. Truly. Maria smiled. It was not a nice smile. Is that so? My blades have grown dull these last few days. My lady, I must insist it's most dangerous for Maria's enemies more like. Naruto couldn't help but take pity on him. Funny thing, he patted his arm. We're actually going to settle there. Hence the wagon and the knights. Is that so? Alexander puffed up. I see. You're capable fighters, then. At their nods, he laughed anew. Very well, I shall help you clear it out, and so repay my debt to you. Determined fellow, wasn't he? Naruto felt the beginnings of a smile touch his face. All right. We'd be glad of the help. He had no way of knowing, but he just found his truest friend in all the lands between. A true friend indeed. The truest of all. What is better, to be born good, or to overcome your evil nature through great effort? I won't lie. I've been tempted a time or two. To give in. To have power. But I'm better than that. It's our turn. Now we rise. We Rise Stormvale was home to all manner of men and monstrosities. In the absence of its long-lost lord, a pack of bandits had infested the castle keep and made it their own. If that weren't enough, a great many of them had taken to taming breaking beasts for their amusement, wretched feral creatures with weapons welded unto their limbs by heavy chains, weapons they wielded to devastating effect against any who dared to assail their home. There could be no sparing such wretched creatures after what their masters had done to them. They were forced to put them to the sword wherever they encountered them. Not only them, but these wicked men and women who knew only how to take from one another, how to hurt, and never to heal. Made his blood boil that it did. Under any other circumstance Naruto might have pitted them. No, wait. He didn't. Violence was both answer and the question here. That wasn't to say the enemy put up a proper fight, of course. Theirs was a strong party, properly skilled and trained alike. Victory was never in doubt. Kill the kid, one of the bandits brayed. Kill him before he died gurgling on 7 inches steel as wickedly curved daggers punched up through his Naruto rode the man's corpse to the ground, watching the light drain from the man's eye. He stared down at the slack body beneath him, making certain it wouldn't rise again. This far from Lendl, there was no need to restrain himself, no need to hide his power properly. Destined death sang with him when he fought. Any who died to his daggers remained that way, dead forever. Satisfied, he rip his weapons free and move on to his next victim. That one died instantly too. They all did. Each was a quick death, silent and deadly. It was more than they deserved. His foes were the lucky ones. Maria took her time with her opponents, boiling them alive with her burning blood. Least lucky of all were those who faxed Alexander. Being beaten to death was a poor way to go. Naruto stomped over another corpse and stalked up the steps leading to the central keep. His comrades waded in after him, Maria on his right, Yorshika lingering at his left, while jolly Alexander brought up the rear. Oleg's twins' words and Engvall's spear made short work of any stragglers that sought to harry their flank. Together, the 6 of them cut a bloody path to the keep. It was here that he learned his shadow was no weak wallflower. You needn't put yourself in undue danger, my lord. Yorshika whispered softly as he intercepted another bandit that sought her herd. I am not so weak as I appear. He risked a glance back as he stopped another man's heart. Was she weak? He had no way of knowing how weak or strong a shadow was, least of all her. He scarcely knew her, after all. What few shadows he'd seen were few and far between. Blade had been a powerhouse, yet Godwin's was the opposite, to say nothing or Miquela and Melinia's ilk. Who could say what Yorshika was capable of? Be that as it may, the dragonling's tail cracked out, tripping up a woodbekiller that strayed just a bit too close. The battered bandit stumbled and she stepped in to catch him before he fell. Her foe found no succor in her arms. Clawed fingers scythed forth, cleaving his head clean off his shoulders in a grisly display. Her point made, she whirled and kicked his corpse aside as one might a straw doll. It struck a wall and left a sizable dent in the mortar. His meek shadow turned a smile upon him. Thou wert saying. Naruto whistled in return. I stand corrected. What followed was a slaughter. Almost anticlimactic, really. None of the squatters provided a proper challenge for any of them. If this band of brigands had a leader, he never met them. Perhaps they fled ahead of them. Didn't matter. In short order the rest of the bandits and their pets were put to the sword, their bodies piled high to be disposed of later. None would rise again. Conquering the castle was the easy part. Holding it, he soon learned, would prove another matter entirely. Strictly speaking, the walls of Stormvale were sound. Many a Ista had been left unmanned during their attack, lacking proper ammunition, but the gates still worked well enough. They were quick to close the latter behind them to prevent further egress by any would-be invaders. From there the rest of the day descended into mind-numbing minutiae. Seek the bounty beneath Stormvale, the Greater Will had told him. Seek it and prosper. Naruto found himself tempted to do so here and now, but this wasn't the time. There was much work to do and precious little time in which to do it. Repairs to assess, inventories to check, filthy rooms to clean and corridors to clear, not to mention checking the larder. If their guests had raided it, they were in for a rough few weeks. They clearly did not care for the state of the castle, and he held little hope they'd left the latter untouched. All this had to be done before winter, less than 3 months away. If they couldn't effect some semblance of repairs, they would starve or freeze. And wouldn't that be an ignoble end for him and his allies after all this? Marika be damned, he must make this work. He couldn't fail here and crawl back to Landel. He wouldn't, absolutely not. He refused. And what was that noise? A distant ringing caught his ears as they cleared yet another room. It came from an adjacent wall not 3 paces ahead, a steady clang 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 punctuated by the odd grunt and growl as someone or something struck steel against steel with relentless determination. Maria and Yorshka each tensed at his side, immediately moving to protect him. There was no need. At first brush one might mistake it for combat, but no, that wasn't the sound of 2 men trying to kill another. If anything, it sounded like he touched the wall, only for his hand to pass clean through it. An illusory wall. Clever and so very curious. Maria scowled at him. Don't you dare. Alexander rumbled a laugh. I'll just wait out here, shall I? I'm much too large to fit through there. Naruto felt a glance over his shoulder. If you're after the bodies, you can have them. That's how you jars get stronger, right? Take Oleg and Engel with you. They can help you find some choice corpses. Quite so, the warrior jar boomed a laugh and trundled off. By your leave. Then stepping through the illusion, he found himself standing in a large, messy alcove. Heat assailed his face and he soon saw the source. A blazing forge littered with blades. An old scaly misbegotten smith stood hunched over an anvil, barrackstead, wearing naught but a tattered red cloth about his waist. He paid them no mind, muttering to himself, relentlessly hammering at a weapon with his hammer. He couldn't see what it was at this angle, only that it was quite large. Downright massive. 7 swift assailed the superheated metal into the desired shape, one after the other, without pause. Belatedly, he noticed something else. The misbegotten's legs were chained to the wall, his bindings stretched taut just to reach the smithy. Piss us off, Marcus. The creature growled once, but didn't look up from his work. I'll have your axe ready tomorrow, and not a DMN minute sooner. Naruto coughed into a fist. I don't know any Marcus H. The misbegotten paused, looked up, squinted at him now. A trembling hand set his hammer down. A demigod as I live and breathe. Didn't think you noble sorts left the capital. His scaly old brow furrowed further, noticing the BLD on him and his companions. Seems, OL storm vials under new management. Not bad for a bunch of exiles. Oh dear. Yorshka absolutely hissed. Maria bridled beside him. You will address my lord with respect. Naruto waved her down, made curious by the man's blunt speech as much as his insight. You can tell. Ain't strong to tell. The old misbegotten shrugged and returned to his task. Your kind never come down to Limgrave anymore. His hammer descended upon the long haft of the axe once more with a hearty clang. You're either an exile or off your head. Probably the latter if I'm being honest. He quirked a pale brow. Any other insights you'd care to share with us, sir? Kurama rumbled a laugh. Interesting. I like this old geezer. Of course he would name's Hugh. The misbegotten looked him up and down. Sniffed once. One of Godwin's are ye. You have that air about ya. Which me answer. Hugh snapped his fingers as realization dawned. You must be Godric. He granted him a wry grin, visibly preening at the carnage he'd caused. Runt of the litter, was it? Seems this Runt has fangs. Clever old man. Dangerous old man. Unbidden, he recalled a warning Runni had once given him. Beware of the old man in a profession where men usually die young. Misbegotten usually lived short, brutal lives, growing stronger as they aged. That one had endured so long, let alone as a smith that was worthy of respect, if not caution. His gaze strayed back to the taut chains binding the old man's ankles. They were old and rusted. He'd been here for a terribly long time. What's your story? Curiosity got the better of him, loosening his tongue. Why are you here? Same reason as you, I suppose? Hugh rumbled a bitter, fearful laugh. I made the queen angry. Suppose you could say I made a weapon she didn't like. His chained tail twitched, shoulders shuddering as he recalled some distant, unknowable memory. She broke me and cast me out the capital for it. Bandits found me soon thereafter. A shallow bow followed his words, as best the chains allowed. And here I am. One finally raspy laugh racked the old man's back, ending in a low cough. Are you going to kill me? Finish what she started all those years ago. Maria laid a hand on the hilt of her blade. If you longing such a release, I will gladly grant you it. No, Yorshka shook her head. We must free him. He's as much a victim in this as us perhaps, she allowed, but he desires death. I can see it in his eyes. You cannot claim to know such a thing enough. Naruto avoked a hand out and the chains binding Hyuga sittered like so much glass. Thanks for that. The old misbegotten stood and stretched over his anvil, popping his back. Had a nasty cramp. Seeing as you were kind enough to spare me, I'll give you a warning. A woman in black came through here earlier, looking for you. Said something about waiting. Dastards threw her in a cell. Might want to steer well clear of her. And you? Hyuga considered him for a long moment. What about me? He really was going to make him say it. I'm asking what you'll do now. Oh, Yorshka hopped in place. Say you'll stay. We'd be honored to have a smith of your caliber shine. The curmudgeonly old codger took one look at his shadow and actually listened. No need to beg me, girl. Don't really have anywhere else to go. Although, he looked past the lot of them, to that weapon left untended upon his forge, still unfinished. I'm thinking I might have use for that weapon I was working on after all. Naruto squinted at it. You're giving me that axe. Hyuga preened. A weapon fit for the Prince of Stormvale. He guffawed, incredulous. The demon thing's bigger than I am and it's still not finished. You'll grow into it, Lord Godric. The surly beak clapped him on the back. Of that I'm certain. Bloody Bastard was enjoying this, he just knew it. Another gift. Another thing to worry about. There was much to be done. Screw it. Only one thing for it, then. He'd have to bend the rules. There was work to be done. And he'd spent more than enough time dragging his feet. No more. He had the beginnings of a support structure here. It fell to him to build upon it. For that he'd need hands. A great many hands. Hands aplenty. Follow if you want. I've got work to do. His piece said, Naruto performed a quick about-face, marched out of the alcove. Maria and Yorshka hastened after him, for once he left them behind, his ears deafened to their words as he considered what he was about to do. He'd refrained from playing this card for some time now, but there was no point keeping it up his sleeve any longer. Down the hall he went, leaving them in his wake until he reached the courtyard proper. They'd be terribly cross with him for startling them like this, but forgive him in due time. He let his gaze rake across the yard, its dying grass and pitted stones, the moldering corpses strewn about. He could see already Alexander trundling his way, flanked by Oleg and Engvall. The trio doubt alarmed by his sudden exit. Even Hyuga had limped out of the castle after them, shielding his face from the sun with one arm. These were his allies. His followers. It fell to him to protect them. Look after them. Give them a safe place to live, secure from all the worries of the world. He wouldn't let them down. A crisp fall breeze his face, tugging at his hair. He closed his eyes and reveled in it, tilted his head back, exhaled softly. From there he crossed his fingers and marshaled his chakra. It came to him in a heady rush, eager to be used after so long. Kurama boosted it yet further, until Alexander guffawed. I say, Yorshka gasped. My Lord Godric. Maria made a rare noise of appreciation. What? You really were holding back all this time? Of course he had been. Discretion was the better part of restraint. He'd practiced the latter for years now. No longer. When he opened his eyes, he found himself gazing upon an army, 100 strong clones, all wearing his face. They stood before him, awaiting his orders, his own private army. All right, boys, he moved a fist into the air. There's work to be done, let's get to it, 100 voices cried out in unison. And so it began. He found her cell soon thereafter. Rusty hinges squeaked, snapped now, as he tore the door from its hinges. The woman awaited him sprawled within, wrapped in a black robe, just as Hyuga had said. She smelled of death. I greet thee, heir of Godwin. Thank you for coming alone. Although she lacked the strength to stand after the torture she'd endured, her smile still held its gentle, mature charm. "Long have I waited here for you." It certainly looked like it. She'd taken a terrible beating. One of her legs was bent the wrong way and she had an awful black eye besides. Just looking at her injuries stirred something in his soul. He found himself tempted to bring the bandits back, if only to kill them a second and third time besides. "Are you all right? You do not know me, but I was told of you." She dragged herself up into a sitting position, wincing only a little when he knelt before her. "My name is Fia. I carry your sire's last will and testamento." Her words peaked into a gasp as he laid healing hands on her. "That feels quite nice actually." A tiny gasp fled from her lips as her legs snapped back into place. "I was unaware you possessed such a talent." "Words can wait." He offered her an earthen cup of water and went to work on her eye. "Drink first. You've been here for days." "Kind of you, but unnecessary." She shook her head. "My health is not important. My task is of paramount." He pressed the cup to her lips, muffling her words. Drink," he hummed with a thin smile, "or you'll be made to drink." She giggled instead, likely more than a little delirious from lack of food and water. "You truly are of his BLD. Always thinking of others before yourself." "Very well." She drained the cup, then, when she was certain he wouldn't offer her another, reached into her robe and withdrew a sealed piece of parchment. Trembling fingers pressed it into his hands. "For you." Naruto broke the seal without a second thought. From there, he began to read. Then came the laughter. The first peasant arrived a week later. A man and his daughter, a sickly girl carried on his back. He asked for aid. Healing. The blessing of the demigods. Blessings were given, the girl mended, and the two of them afforded a place to stay. They were the first, but they would not be the last. Word went out to the surviving hamlets. What few scattered towns remained in Limgrave despite the scourge. Before long, folks came to visit. People, peasants, supplicants all, begging for his aid, his intervention, his wisdom, his resources. Marika was laughing at him back in the capital. Naruto knew she was. One and all they came to the castle in search of shelter. Many were willing to work so long as they had food in their bellies and a roof over their heads. A lesser lord would have left it at that. Naruto did not. He paid them for their LBR, each and every one of them. And there was coin and runes to be had, so too did the merchants come. 2 at first, then more, drawn by the promise of protection, profit, and the chance to pawn their wares. Within 3 moons a thriving community sprang up within the castle as well as without. All this from a single act of kindness. Stormvale began to thrive. Marika wouldn't learn of the castle's revival until many moons later. And when she did, some said her shrieks could be heard clear across the lands between. So too could the laughter of a boy. Runt of the litter. How did he do this, Radagon? Who helped him? No one. I warned you, but you would not listen. You underestimated him. Of course I underestimated him. He's a weakling, the runt of the litter, shame of my lineage, and now he is so much more. Your spite is the cause of this, sister mine. Now what will you do about it? A queen's folly. Runt no more. Naruto read Godwin's letter aloud to his allies. Dear descendant, if you are here reading this, chances are Runni and I have passed. In body or spirit, I know not. There is no way of knowing which way the coin shall land, who shall live and who shall die. Likewise, it is difficult to know how the ritual will unfold without experiencing it directly. But this must be done. The night of the black knives must occur, if there is to be change. I have no doubt Mother will take our deaths poorly. I would ask you to keep her from doing anything rash, but she has likely already exiled thee by now. It is my belief that she will send you and your new shadow away to Stormvale, if only because it is the furthest from the capital. In any case, you may trust in Yorshka. She is no threat to you at present. It's nearly time now. I must be brief. Little Godric, my BLD, my descendant. I am so sorry for the fate move upon thee. I know I have not shown thee the love thy deserved, and I will regret that until my dying day and beyond. If there is a hell, then I will likely find myself there soon enough. But I beg of you, grow, prosper, seek out allies and make your own way in this world. You already have Maria and Yorshka, but FIA is another such ally. She is as loyal to the concept of death as she is me, and shall not lead you astray. Remind this world that destined death has its proper place. Carve it into the hearts of your enemies, my heir. Remind them that even gods fear death. I'm sure most of the family will resist your efforts in the years to come. Marika and Radagon cannot change, as you know. One is too set in her ways, the other too loyal to the greater will. Morgott and Radon are not so bad. Perhaps one may yet help you. Do not trust Rykard and Mog. They will use you. Miquella and Maelnia have an agenda of their own, and I suspect it will intersect with yours. For good or ill I cannot say. Mayhaps you will make peace with them or kill them. I do not know. I cannot speak for great Godfrey or Malekith, for I know not where they are. My visions have not seen thus. If Runni yet lives, then I am certain she will seek you out in time. Perhaps, in that regard, you ought write a letter to Renala as well. Runni's mother is friend to neither Marika nor Radagon and would gladly aid you if only out of spite. Raya Lucaria is close to Stormvale and would prove a powerful ally in the chaos to come. Finally, a last word of advice from one who never gave you enough. The people of the lands between call you a runt. Let them know what you are. Wear that word like armor and no one will be able to use it to hurt you. We share the same BLD after all. I know you will rise to your new station. And if you yet encounter me, or some twisted form of McKillme, I wish you good fortune in the wars to come, little Godric. Godwin. By the time he finished speaking, his throat was hoarse and his eyes were burning all over again. Diamin Godwin. Who was he, a dead man, to tell him what to do? The arrogance of it all. The goal. He nearly laughed again, an angry, bitter thing that threatened to explode from him at the slightest provocation. Somehow, reading it aloud to his allies hurt more. Oh dear. Alexander found his voice first, arms crossed before his cracked shell. Quite the family you have there, old chap. Oleg and Engvil exchanged a brisk glance between one another and said nothing. They didn't have to. Their stoic silence spoke volumes. He knew. Yorshka looked up from where she sat, wringing her hands. We never met, but he knew my name before I was even created. Begging your pardon, Fizz sprawled herself upon a lounging couch and sighed softly. But this was his way. Your grandsire was trying to prevent the end of the world. Naruto turned a baleful glare on her. Fine job he did. Then Lord Godwin was ever a strange one. Maria rolled one shoulder in a shrug. I hear he suffered from visions even before I met him. Perhaps that's why he assigned me to Lord Godric at such a young age. It still didn't excuse what he did. Aggravated by the letter as much as its contents, Naruto crumpled it in one fist and threw it into the hearth. It struck the flames and began to sizzle in the heat. He stood there for a long moment, watching the paper blacken and curl. If he's dead, then let him stay dead, and what of Runni? We'll cross the bridge when we come to it. Maria touched a hand to his wrist. What now? Mariko won't leave us alone. He stared into the flames, watching them char the last of the letter to ash. If it's war they wants, then we wage war. He marched away from the fireplace. Send a raven to Lady Renala. I've got work to do, and where are you going? He gave her a baleful look. Below. He'd tarried long enough. Now the bounty of Stormvale awaited. Must you go now? Yorshka tugged him back. Surely whatever treasure lies beneath the castle can wait. We've barely enough men to hold the walls as is, never mind protecting the people. The logistics of lordship. How he loathed them. What would you suggest, then? His shadow preened. Well, for starters, I think we've left Godric be long enough. Take 20 good men, go to Stormvale and see what the runt has made. Bring him to heel. And if he does not bend the knee to us, what then? What should I do? A heavy silence reigned between them. You already know. Radagon's child bowed their head. As you wish, father. The bounty beneath Stormvale was not what Naruto had expected. He'd meant to come down here from the beginning, but there just hadn't been enough time. 2 years. 2 long years he'd spent building Stormvale up from nothing, recruiting banished knights to his ranks, finding a steward, repairing the walls, building up the villages surrounding it. From there it became more difficult. Not only did he have to ensure their safety, but he must make sure they were secure, able to retreat to the castle proper in a pinch. To that end a choke point of sorts had been created in the tunnel leading to the gate. Any intrepid soul foolish enough to assault the castle now would be met with a rain of fire and ista bolts besides. But finally after so long, he was here. It had been a grueling climb downward. In that regard, he found himself inordinately grateful for his new height. Longer legs and arms made for easier climbing, and his newfound strength was a boon. He'd hit something of a growth spurt since leaving Landel behind, and it didn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. It likely won't. I said you'd hit your potential later rather than sooner. Kurama's compliments aside, he'd thought to find gold and jewels, legendary relics, perhaps a mythical weapon to aid him in his quest. Instead he found didn't know what this was. This place reeked of death. Skulls and bones lay scattered about the waste, limned in one sunlight from above. And there below him, prowling about like some kind of caged dog, something awaited him. It was a creature, of that there could be no doubt, but he wasn't sure what. Long and sinuous, it writhed and coiled across the ground, dragging itself about on long, spindly arms. Back and forth it paced seemingly without purpose, adrift and mindless. If it noticed him looking down on it from above, it gave no sign. It simply continued its lonely vigil. Poor creature. He could see the cysts and tumors growing on its serpentine hide from here. Merely moving seemed to cause a pain, judging by the angry growls it made. What was it? Naruto lowered the binoculars from his eyes. What are you? An tree spirit? He looked to his elbow, only to find Maria and Yorshika there, each dressed for battle. An ulcerated one at that. It was the former who spoke. I didn't think to find one in such a place. Thought I told you two not to follow me down here. Maria lifted her chin in return. I am your sword, my lord. And I am your shadow. Yorshika granted him a small smile. My place is at your side. There really was no arguing with them sometimes. Fine, be stubborn. What's to be done with this thing, then? Maria drew her blades. I expect we'll have to kill it if we want to see what's down there. Best to be quick and put it out its misery. What? No, Yorshika flung out her arms to stop her, voice peaking in protest. You mustn't, can't you see it's suffering? We should help it. The beast heard her cry and rounded on him with a sibilant hiss, glaring hatefully up at them. Well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Naruto slung himself over the edge with a sigh and landed before it. Maria and Yorshika weren't far behind. Fetid water splashed beneath their boots, bringing with it a foul stench. The tree spirit reared back with a wordless snarl. He knew at once it would try to bite him if he approached. He waved his sword and shadow back. He held up his hands and dropped his daggers near a shallow puddle. Friendly. Friend. I'm not going to hurt you. Wrong words. The ulcerated tree spirit boiled forward and snapped at him with its toothless maw. In that instant, a voice stabbed at his mind. Suffering pain hurts, I know it does. He held up a hand. You're protecting something here, aren't you? A wordless whimper pervaded the air between them. Must protect the Lord. Naruto quirked a pale brow. Gotwin istiat. No, not dead. Worse than death. What did that mean? Then let me see him, he said instead, choosing his words carefully. You did your job well, but you've done enough. You've earned your rest. He touched a hand to its ruined hide. I release you. A wordless keening noise answered him. Light rose, burning so bright he found himself forced to avert his gaze. He expected it to fade away. It did not. When the burning beacon dimmed, he found himself looking at. What manner of madness was this? A small child, a girl clad in a ragged black gown and bits of broken bark, blinked up at him. Dark hair, shading eyes of the purest of silver. Tiny little thing. She barely came up to his waist. She turned those piteous eyes upon him now. You're nice. Her voice was soft, trembling weakly. You sound like mother. Are you my mother? Naruto tried to speak. His brain fizzled. All he managed was thus. Yorshika absolutely squealed. Can we keep her? Absolutely not, Maria chided. We don't even know what she is, let alone her name. Naruto sighed, looking past the girls as they squabbled. And in doing so, he saw. Here at last he beheld that which the tree spirit was so staunchly guarding. It was a face. Gotwinsvak. Carved in rotten thorny roots. Well, that can't be good. I had not thought you a betting man, Godric. Are you kidding? I've gambled on worse odds before and won. But ask yourself this. Now that you've seen me, now that you know what I'm capable of, do you really want to bet against me? It's your choice, all the smoke. Make a bet. It took Naruto the better part of 3 days to convince the tiny tree spirit that he was not, in fact, her mother. Nor was he her father for that matter, so past a 4th day. Unfortunately, his explanations did nothing to prevent the little one from following him around like a lost duckling. Far from it, wherever he went in Stormvale, this child would inevitably follow in his wake, ever watching, always waiting, constantly trying to hold his hand as though she were afraid he would up and abandon her the moment she took her eyes off him. Be it from meetings, to the sparring hall, whenever he held court down in the lower towns, even sleeping in the same room as him, she had to be by his side. He didn't have the heart to push her away. The servants found her adorable. And she was, if only because she seldom said anything and he didn't rightly know what to do with her. He couldn't cast her out of Stormvale. Where would she even go? And besides, he didn't even have a name for her either. He couldn't simply call her Tree either, that would be rude. In the end he took the easy way out, settling for something that sounded somewhat like the girl's namesake, Teresa. Little lass seemed happy enough with his choice. Having a name made her somewhat less clingy, if only just. It made her start clinging to others too. Maria and Yoshika were of no help at all on that front. His right hand and his shadow were soon smitten with Stormvile's newest guest and took every chance to pamper her. Alexander was a lost cause as well. The warrior jar had taken to insisting that Teresa call him Uncle Alexander. The little one was all too happy to oblige. By some mercy or miracle, she'd run off somewhere with him today, no doubt riding him round the castle. Just as well, there were other problems to which he must attend. Case in point, he was dealing with one at this very moment. He glanced at the wall, touched a hand to his head, and scratched another mark there with a piece of charcoal, higher than the rest. It happened again. Shaking his head, he stalked across the room to his writing desk and recorded his findings once more. Another inch. You see, he was growing. Rather quickly at that, nearly an inch a day, sometimes more. He'd finally hit his growth spurt. At least it didn't come as a surprise. Since that he'd escaped from Landel, he couldn't regard his exile as anything but, and the constant abuse he suffered, it was only natural that his body would flourish. He was going to be tail at this rate. Add in his training regiment with the muscle he was building and well, he scarcely recognized himself these days. If this continued, he might have to see his way to hiring a mage and hiding his true appearance behind an illusion. After all, it wouldn't do for the rest of the lands between to know what he truly was yet. Look on the bright side. You'll be able to use that axe soon. Naruto winced, recalling the ghastly golden abomination Hyuga had forged for him. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Kurama's laughter wasn't at all feigned. What can I say? It's not every day I get to see you squirm like this. It's almost refreshing. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were terrified of little Teresa. He had no idea how to be a parent. The fox's laughter redoubled. He flung up his arms and threw himself into his chair to sort through his letters. You're no help at all. His personal correspondence offered little reprieve from the stress of ruling today. He found a mocking letter from Rykard and an inquiry from Radagon asking after his health. The former, he tossed in the burning hearth, the latter he kept to finish reading later. Besides those, there were yet more pleas for aid. Talk of a dragon in the lake, ghosts haunting the hills. Nope, not having that. And stranger still, word of a wayward crucible knight that only appeared at, night. He answered them as best he could and wrote out replies with brisk dispatch. Many ravens were sent that day, urged out his window with weighty replies attached to their legs. So much to see, so much to do, so much to say. Running a castle town was strong. He might be touched by destined death, but his concerns lay with his people, his kin, his comrades. There was also the matter of that thing below Stormvale. No one was allowed beneath the keep, not with that horrid face growing down there. He didn't know what it was or why it resembled Godwin, but it was nothing good. Touching it seemed a bad idea, but he'd have to go back down there and deal with it soon. Couldn't keep it quarantined forever. He'd written a brief letter to Renala asking about such, but he didn't hold out hope for much of a reply. Radagon's betrayal had wounded her deeply, body and soul. Then she had lost Runni atop that, her only daughter, a daughter who may or may not be dead, as he found the timing of her demise far too suspicious while her remaining children were loyal to the Golden Order, which she wholeheartedly despised. Imagine his surprise then, when he opened another letter now and saw the seal of Raya Luke Arya. Had he missed this one? May as well see what she wanted. 5 terse words awaited him within. Why should I trust thee? Well. There was only one response worth giving, and when he did something, he did it all the way. Raya Luke Arya and Stormveil weren't far apart. A quick raven could ferry replies between them in less than a day. Because we've both been betrayed by your husband and Marika. Because we're outcasts. But most importantly, because I think Runni might still be alive. And I'm the only one willing to look for her. He couldn't quite hide his smile as he penned the last bit, an intentional provocation both to prick her pride and draw out a response. What say you to that, my queen? In a matter of minutes he had another raven wheeling away out the window and thought no more of it. He had other letters to write, more dispatches to dictate. Imagine his surprise then, when that very same raven came back within an hour, bearing not a message, but a tiny mirror clutched within its claws. Well, tiny was a relative term. Blasted thing was larger than his fist. He took it from the weary corvid. Poor thing must have flown far and fast and set it down, took a book to prop it up, then considered it for a long moment. It was a simple thing, not glittering with the gold of the order, but a gleaming silver inlaid with sapphires at the rim. His own puzzled reflection started back at him, looking just as confused as he felt. Closer inspect revealed a little note tucked under the inlay. Touch me. Because that wasn't suggestive at all. All right, he muttered, stroking it with a finger. Now what are you and what do you do? It flared to life at his touch, a pale blue light overtaking his reflection before rippling out like so much water. He leaned closer, squinting at it, only to find the darkness of a moonless night. Without warning it cleared away and he found himself face to with a weary woman who couldn't be anyone other than Runni's mother. And in an instant he understood. Oh, so this was one of those communication mirrors he'd heard so much about. Naruto winced despite himself. It was his first time ever seeing her up close, and she didn't make the best impression. Renala looked awful. Dark circles rimmed her red eyes, suggesting she'd been crying, and recently at that in her sleepless nights. Her long crown had been cast aside to reveal dirty black hair in desperate need of a wash, her clothing rumpled and filthy. Was that blood on her robes? He hoped not. A large amber egg lay in her lap, nestled upon one knee and protected in her arm. She scowled down upon it, looking like she wanted to sitter the demon thing until she noticed his gaze. Her bright eyes narrowed upon him at once. Speak, little Godric. And be quick about it. What do you know of my daughter? Many things. He hedged, not willing to show his hand just yet. I'd like to ask a favor of you first. What do you want? An alliance between Stormveil and Raya Luke Arya would be nice. He watched her eyes widen a little as he said the words. So her mind wasn't completely gone. Not yet. A pact of non-aggression and a promise to aid one another in trying times to come. Is that all? She practically tripped over the words in her haste to get them out. Done. I have lost one child too many already. Now explain how it is that you believe Runni lives. All right, then. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so he spoke. It proved a STMLTNG conversation. By the end of it, Renala had much to think about. And with those thoughts, an ember of hope was kindled. She wanted to hope. She wanted to believe that somehow her daughter lived. Her crimes mattered not, her form mattered not, so long as little Runni yet survived. For if she lived, if she had found freedom from the Golden Order, the sweet poison of hope, did she dare drink it? It was too much to hope Stormveil would be left to her own devices after that conversation. In hindsight, it should have been rather obvious. They were thriving. Others weren't. More than that, their communication with Raya Luke Arya had been noticed. Naruto supposed that was his own mistake. He'd been reckless. Hasty. And so it was that Praetor Rykard came to call the very next day. Godric received him in the throne room, perched upon the grand chair of Stormveil, out in the open air, the better to see the storm wreathing the castle. Even so, he was careful not to make any sudden moves. Doing so might well break the carefully crafted illusion layered upon him. After all, it wouldn't do so show his hand here. And besides, it would make the moment he did move all the more amusing. Oleg and Engvall remained silent sentinels beside him as ever, but he could sense a hint of restless unease from the banished knights as they stood guard. Engvall hadn't let go of his spear since he had seen Rykard, while Oleg kept checking his blades, ready to draw them if need be. The less said of Maria and Yorshka the better. They looked livid. Little Teresa stood nestled behind them, clinging to the latter's skirt while a watchful Alexander loomed over them all. It was humbling to know they were willing to stand with him even now. Rykard was much as he remembered. A bit taller perhaps, older, a little thinner in the face with a bristling red beard, but beneath that he remained every bit the bully he'd been before. A great pity. He'd hoped time and distance might have mellowed the man with his marriage. Not so, evidently. Hello, little Godric. His voice had an odd rasp to it that hadn't existed prior. It's been some time. Still clinging to life, I see. Hello, Rykard. He replied with a smile that he no longer felt, if he ever had. You look well. Of course I do. Power suits me. Would that I could say the same of thee. Naruto twitched. He mustn't kill him permanently. He absolutely mustn't, no matter how much he might wish to. Whatever his flaws, this was Renala's son. She would be terribly upset if he died. That didn't preclude a beating, however. If it came to a fight, he'd be sure to leave her precious baby boy alive, well, mostly. Still, to attack him without provocation would make him seem the villain. What brings you here? Rather than retort, Rykard looked to Teresa and seeked a scarlet brow. Had a whelp already, have you? Naruto's smile became a touch more strained. He wrestled his temper down. In a sense. Radagon's son scoffed. Where is the mother? She looks nothing like you. Don't be rude to Papa Lovely. He'd need another 3 days to break Teresa of that habit again. I suppose it doesn't matter, Rykard prattled on in his grand, posturing way. You asked why I have come, and so I shall answer. You've done well for yourself. Nevertheless, you owe fealty to the Golden Order. As such, I've come for tribute. Maria tilted her head. What manner of tribute? Rykard's smile was an ugly thing indeed. He wasn't going to like this, was he? This year's harvest for starters, he began to count down off the fingers of his right hand. All the runes you've accumulated, your subjects, that warrior jar over yonder, and of course, her. He turned golden eyes upon a startled Teresa. If she is your heir, the queen will want to see her. Your words, not mine, nephew. Yorshka hissed. You man to beggar us. Naruto feigned a smile. Funny you should mention tribute, because you owe me a few years of pain. Rykard blinked, confused. Maria and Yorshka were shying away from him. But he didn't understand. He looked back to Oleg and Engvall, who had also stepped away. He was still looking that way when a spark of light moved in his peripherals. A golden axe dented older demigod's face, creating a rather humorous expression right until momentum caught up with Rykard and launched him into the courtyard. What was it you called me? Naruto stood. The illusion sittered. Little Godric. He rumbled the words. Runt of the litter. His shadow loomed large over Rykard, casting him in his shadow. Who's the runt now? This could not be. It must not be. It just couldn't be. He was being battered about left, right, and center, not by a warrior, but a whelpim praetor. Rykard, chief inquisitor and enforcer of the Golden Order, he was superior. Godric was inferior. For a goodly portion of his life, he had picked on this weakling of a whelp without fear of reprisal. And yet he was losing. It didn't make a LCK of sense. Where was this power coming from? Had it always been there, lurking just under the surface? Had he been humoring them all this time? Had they been made fools of? No, it couldn't be that one. It just couldn't. Pride slammed back into place, walling off common sense once more. Surely not. Nothing worked. Magma hexes splashed harmlessly against his chi, and he kept coming. He swung his sword and it sittered to golden shards on his skin. What are you? He railed at him, to no avail. What in order's name are you? You blithering braggart, I'll have your head for this really. Godric blinked once, pausing to heft his axe. Excuse me. His voice, so pleasant most of the time, thrummed now with subtle menace. Surely you didn't just insult me in my own home. Even you're not that stupid. Rykard scowled, not quite comprehending until his leg snapped. Art thou happy now? Art thou pleased? Art thou enough? I'm tired of talking like this. He wiped a bloody hand through his hair, staining it red. No more games. Godric inhaled deeply through his nose, drinking in the fumes. And then he smiled. Daddy's not here to protect you this time, Rykard. Be a man and take your lumps. Rykard raised a hand to defend himself. Godric broke it backwards. He screamed. It wasn't even fun by the end. Rykard starting crying after he broke his arms, followed by his legs. His face he saved for last. No point using the axe there. He beat him bloody, leaving him a fat lip, a broken nose and 2 black eyes besides. No inch of him was spared. Finally, he passed out from the pain. Even in sleep he hated that ugly face. Wanted to kill him, but he couldn't. It would ruin his fledgling alliance with Raya Lucaria, not to mention Renala. He would have spared him this once. He heard a strange noise then. It almost sounded like drums, but that was absurd. There was no army near here, none that he'd seen or sensed. So where was it coming from? Under his feet? No, so where above a shadow plummeted from the sky. Naruto recognized its shape far too late. Someone roared a warning behind him. Dragon, a massive missile of scales and death rocketed out of the clouds and shot straight down at him. Oi, 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 he kicked Rykard's unconscious aside and he flung up a hand to defend himself. Pull up already, ya big bee. The beast most assuredly did not. He had time to glimpse the pain in its scaly visage before the world went white. Contrary to what some might think, it actually took a fair bit of strength to stop an ancient dragon in its tracks, especially one that had fallen from such a height. The ground buckled beneath them, then he whirled and tossed him aside. The beast landed with a thunderous boom, blasting everyone backward as it righted itself on 4 wings, nearly flattering everyone, save him. Its scales were blackened, its body twisted. Its very soul reeked of destined death. You, it rasped, descendant of Godwin, I would have words. He'd heard of a dragon like this. He knew its name. Naruto tilted his head. Fortisax. Very well. And now it begins. Now it ends. You just haven't realized it. Consider your fears. It wasn't every day Naruto entertained a dragon in his courtyard. Come to think of it, he'd never really met a proper dragon in the flesh before, let alone one that talked. It was something of a novel experience for him, and frankly, he wasn't sure whether it was a good one. Part of him was curious as to Fortisax's sudden presence here in Stormvale. The rest of him wanted to send this uppity dragon packing for interrupting his beating of Rykard. Was it? Said Demigod groaned where he lay underfoot, starting to stir. A vicious kick to the head made certain he wouldn't be waking up anytime soon. Although Maria his second appeared at his elbow immediately. My lord. Change of plans. Throw him in the dungeons for now. We'll deal with him later. Happily. She didn't question him, not in public. He wasn't a child anymore, and it showed. I'll see to it at once. She took the older demigod by his heels, lifted his legs and dragged him away. And if Rykard cracked his head on every flagstone on the way down, no one cared to mention it. Fortisax rumbled lowly. It took him a moment to realize that the old dragon was actually laughing. You beat him bloody, didn't you? I would expect no less from a scion of Godwin. And without grafting at that, Naruto turned up his nose at the word. Grafting was a vile practice, and one he had no longing to indulge in. Easy paths to power were always the most dangerous. He had no need of such. He'd seen what grafting did to a human body, even killed a few wretched spiders himself since he claimed Stormvale. Anyone who fell to that level of depravity deserved death and nothing less. Their bodies had been nailed to pillars outside the castle and left to the crows for that very reason. But the old WM was speaking to him again, and he must attend for the time being. And I see you've a dragon of your own, or not quite. He amended with a tilt of the head toward Yorshika, even now never far from his side. I see how you hide your tail, little one. Have the fingers made you forget who you are? Did they take your memories from you when they made you thus? His shadow blinked and scooted a little closer to the wounded dragon. You know who I am. Fortisax considered her for a long moment. It is not for me to say. I am sorry. I have sworn an oath and said too much already. I pray that you remember soon. For all our sakes. Yorshika took hold of his elbow and held tight, quivering a little. Naruto sighed. Time to take charge then. To what do we owe this visit? Here at last, Fortisax finally faltered. I have need of your skills, little Godric. Of course you do. He sighed. Everyone does. Well, what is it? Out with it, then. Godwin's old friend lowered himself down on all four, allowing him to glimpse the ugly wounds on his wrists and legs. I have come here to ask your aid in freeing Godwin. When he didn't immediately respond, the dragon mistook his silence for acceptance and barreled on. I made an attempt myself, but was soundly rebuffed, as you can see. He raised one wing, revealing the dark scarred scales below and the foul tendrils festering. He is trapped in a waking nightmare, his spirit slain, but his flesh still alive. None can approach him without being afflicted by the curse of deathblight. But you bear the blessing of destined death itself. Only you can save him. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Save him. I know you can. The world thinks you are weak, boy. Fortisax prattled on. That though thou art a descendant of Godwin and Godfrey, you'll never measure up to them. Young Godric Naruto swept a hand through his silver hair. I do so love being underestimated. Kurama sensed what was coming first. Naruto, just calm down. Calm. He was calm. He was perfectly calm. But I know the truth. The ancient dragon leaned lower and glimpsed his reflection in a giant golden orb. You are more than you seem, far more than meets the eye. You have borne your suffering in good grace, as befits a monarch. Now I ask you to undertake it once more. I know it is too late to return him to this world, but please, put him to rest. That is all I ask. Harsh laughter silenced the dragon. Naruto knew it was petty of him, knew it sounded ugly, but he just couldn't help himself anymore. It was too much, he couldn't hold himself back. All of it came tumbling out, a snicker, a giggle, then an outright cackle. His body bent double as he clutched at his sides, shoulders shaking, all but convulsing with mirth. Yorshika let go of his arm and shied back in quiet dismay, while Fortisax looked at him like he'd grown a second head. For some reason he found that even funnier and laughed all the harder. Why are you laughing? Fortisax sounded genuinely dismayed, his voice conveying what his draconic visage could not. I don't understand. Of course you don't. Naruto raised his head, a wild gleam in his gaze. Because that's just what you do, isn't it? You don't understand. He straightened up and shook his head, FL King, a mirthful tear out the corner of his eye. Tell me, how has that worked out for you? Fortisax bridled. You stormed into Erdtree roots trying to save your friend from death. He tilted his head, pale hair falling over his eyes. But you couldn't. And now you come to me trying to make a deal. Find the one person in the lands between to save him so you can get a shot at redemption. His mouth quirked in an ugly smile. If only someone could have warned you against such a miserable idea. He is your sire, your ancestors, still not hearing a reason to risk my hide for him. The wounded dragon winced. He can right the discord in the lands between, that's nice. I don't care about the lands between. What did he ever do for me? Name one thing decent, selfless thing. He gave you Lady Maria and his blessing. To his credit, Fortisax rallied. It was by his will that you were protected from the moment of your birth. It was the wrong thing to say. Yorshika winced. Hell, even Kurama winced. Protected. Silence was his answer. You have no idea, D. A fresh peal of bitter laughter tumbled out of him. Once again, you don't understand. He palmed his mouth to stifle it, yet it was no use. But that's all right. I'm going to tell you what your Osaprecious Godwin gave Menething. Fortisax balked. Nothing. Nothing. He nodded once. No love, no affection, and so, wait, he held up a finger. I tell a lie. He gave me neglect, great heaping amounts of neglect. His voice peaked, taking on a high, wild note. He threw me to the wolves, knowing Maria couldn't protect me all the time, knowing I would suffer for it. And I did. Beatings and abuse every day, I endured it all with a smile, and when I saw my chance, I got the hell out. And now you cry, oh, woe, go back, save him, Godric. Save him, bah. He slashed a hand through the air. As far as I'm concerned, he can Godric, I am talking. Fortisax, he rounded on the battered dragon with a snarl. You think Godwin's entitled to everything just because he's firstborn, just because he's suffered, but suffering isn't enough. No, he gripped the haft of his axe and slammed it down between them, rattling the whole of Stormvale. Allow me to let you in on a secret I learned at a young age. The corner of his mouth curled. every word dripping with derision. You can't just be strong, you have to be smart. Can't just be deserving, you have to be worthy. Godwin isn't not him, not Marika, not Radagon, not Malenia or Miquella, not Rykard, not even Rada. None of the gods are all you bastards have ever been are a disappointment. The last word struck Fortisax like a hammer and the old WM subsided with a sigh. My apologies. I can see this is a sensitive matter for you. We can continue this tomorrow. He laid a ruined wing over his head, the better to conceal his shame. I need time to rest. Might I make my lair here for the time being? He wanted to say no so very, very badly. But he could feel Yorshka's pitiful, pleading eyes on him. You may. Fortisax settled into wait. Then I shall await your decision come the dawn. Naruto scowled at him. You know what it'll be. Even so, I shall wait. He retreated to his chambers to eat and think. For once, no one bothered him. Not a soul. In a way, Naruto found himself grateful for their silence as much as their understanding. While Maria was busy stringing Rykard up and little Teresa running around the battlements with Alexander, he knew Yorshka was still down in the yard fuming at Fortisax for his folly. He had the distinct feeling his shadow was none too pleased with the old dragon, but even more startled of him after his sudden outburst. Best to give her space. She hadn't been with him as long as Maria had. It would take her time and distance to understand why he'd reacted the way he had. It had felt good to rant at the ancient dragon, no matter what Kurama might say. He'd been meaning to get that off his for a long time, to draw the poison from that old wound. And he had well most of it. Was he better? Not quite. Did he intend to thrash any of family who came knocking? Definitely. There was no need to keep up the charade now. If Miquella or gods forbid Malenia came by to try and collect tribute, he'd afford them the same courtesy he had shown Rykard. Which was to say none at all. A fist knocked at the door. He looked up from the remains of his meal. Enter. The door swung open and Maria emerged bearing a bottle of brandy in each hand. He accepted one from her gratefully and uncorked it, pausing to enjoy the fragrance. How are things? The castle is quiet. She stood at attention before him, the very picture of decorum despite the faint flush on her cheeks. Had she already started drinking without him? The townsfolk are not. At his sigh, she hastened to elaborate. Oleg and Engvall are keeping them back with the guards, but they're curious about Fortisax. Of course they were. Godwin's friend had practically parked himself on their doorstep. Small wonder he was getting attention. Don't let anyone touch him. He took a long sip from the bottle, then gasped a little as it burned his throat going down. It centered him. We can't risk the death bite spreading. Tell him I'm willing to heal him if he keeps to the battlements and out of our hair. Very well. And what is to be done with Rykard? Shave him bald, beard and all, then send him to his mother with a note detailing these words. He waved a hand. Keep your son on a leash. I could have killed him. It shall be done. She turned to go, then paused, considering him. How are you feeling? His temper twitched and he stared at her. How do you think I feel? Poorly, I expect. She said. Godwin is your family, he's not. I have no family. Maria reared back at that, looking hurt. She didn't have a chance to flinch, he did it for her, drawing her quickly into his arms. I didn't mean it like that. He muttered against her shoulder. You and Yorshka are my family now. Not them. I know. And little Teresa. He choked on his spit. You know she isn't really my child, does it matter? She gave his thigh a pat. That tiny tree spirit adores you. The least you can do is pay attention to her. And speaking of his brow furrowed. Speaking of what now? Don't let Fortisax get to you, no matter what he says. You saved us. She sat on his lap and smacked his he when he attempted to protest. Not Godwin or Rykard or any of those idiot gods, but you, Godric. You took Stormvale, lifted it up from a pit of squalor, and turned it into the bustling city it is today. Her finger poked his cheek. Not them. No one can take that away from you. Don't let them try. I won't. A small laugh escaped him when she gave his cheek a vicious pinch. I meant it. His laughter redoubled when she pouted. It's not the first time I've had to deal with something like this, not the first time. Maria considered him for a long moment. Fizz isn't your first life, is it? He went still, surprised by the sudden inquiry. What makes you say that? I had my suspicions. Little things. She made a pinching motion. You were always so mature for your age, enduring horrors in silence that no normal child would. Even now, as a young man, you act old, sometimes. His smile died an ugly death. I don't know what you mean. You can trust me, my lord. Her hands came up to cup either side of his face. Your secret is safe with me. Yorshka, too, she amended after a moment's pause, then looked toward the window, raising her voice a tad louder than necessary. Whenever she finally stops fussing over Fortisax and deigns to join us, a squeak echoed from the courtyard below, echoed by draconic laughter. Naruto almost smiled at her antics. Almost. You're awfully accepting of this. I have to be. Maria's laugh was decidedly weary, almost crazed. You're an enigma. If I don't accept that, I'm fairly certain I'll break. She took another swing of her long bottle. You're also a god. It only makes sense you would live more than life. You needn't tell me about it until you're ready. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. Oi. He gave her hand a smack. That's not how it works. Another now, when she tried to grab his bottle. I'm not a child anymore. Don't treat me like one. I know you aren't. She pivoted in his lap to face him fully, both straddling and startling him in the same moment. I shall not. His eyes widened. Maria. Forgive my indiscretion, but I'm not feeling terribly patient right now. She didn't answer beyond that cryptic remark. Instead, his second leaned closer and pushed him back in his chair. He was bigger than her, so she couldn't plant her legs on either side of him, but she absolutely could and did twine her legs with his to keep him from getting up. Her fingers found his and threaded through them, holding tight. Maria cooed at him. Do you feel like an adult now? Very much so. Heat seared through his face. Bu the mastered it, laying a hand on her hip. You're drunk. May I? She slurred a little, dragging her lips up his neck. Feels better this way. Tired of thinking. Talking to. Too much talking. It would be wrong to take advantage of her like this. But when tried to stand, the chair gave way beneath their combined weight, sending them tumbling to the floor. Maria rode him down with a laugh, and in an instant he became aware of three things. He could feel the fullness of her bosom pressing against his ear, then her hips against his groin now as she sat up, nearly mounting him despite their clothes. Her long pale hair tickling his nose, and her eyes had gone half-lidded, brandy on her breath, lips so close he could feel them brushing his as she leaned down to an awful noise rattled the word. Naruto bolted upright, nearly knocking Maria off him in his haste to rise. He caught her with one arm and reeled her up with him. An attack? No, he didn't sense anything, no negative intent in the least. Another tremor came. And in an instant he knew. Marika should know better. Surely she wasn't that much of a beach. Who was he kidding? Of course she would be. The door crashed open behind him. He heard Yorshika's voice. What's going on? Naruto didn't answer. Couldn't. He dashed to the window and moved his head out into the night. Maria joined him and Yorshika a beat later. Only then did the three of them truly glimpse the catastrophe in its entirety, that great golden gilded light which could be seen to the northeast. He saw the Elden ring high above in all its glory. Fractures of light scrawled across it, and by definition, the sky. As he looked in sheer disbelief, they began to spread, only to mend again a heartbeat later. Another blow shook the world and the fractures became cracks. On and on it went in a vicious seal, the cracks growing larger each time. Would they hold? Would they break? The world held its breath as the sky shuddered again. There could be no other description for such a world-shaking feat. One moment the world was whole, hanging on by the skin of its teeth. Then with a single hammer stroke, with an awful crack, the Elden ring splintered, and from it, the sittering truly commenced. He felt it the moment the world changed. When the sittering began and many of the so-called gods were lessened for it. Many would weep that dark day, for it was the beginning of a war that would ravage the lands between from top to bottom. But not him. Not his beloved Stormveil. No. He wouldn't let it. He refused. Naruto did not weep. On the contrary, he smiled. Because you see, in that moment he finally understood. For him, the sittering wasn't the end of the beginning, it was the beginning of the end. You have a choice, my lords. Surrender or death. Nuerdrei burial, nu hivaivo. Only destined death. What will it be? Meeting of gods. Naruto gave his answer to Fortisax 3 days later. I'll help you. The ancient dragon practically sprang to his feet, long tail swaying to and fro with such force that he nearly conjured a windstorm in the courtyard. It rather reminded Naruto of a giant dog he'd once seen in a storybook. It also made it terribly difficult to cling onto his anger. He didn't hate Fortisax. Really, he didn't. He probably shouldn't at that. The ancient dragon was blameless in his vendetta. He wasn't part and parcel to the abuse he'd suffered, just a blind servant of Godwin who didn't know any better. He couldn't expect him to right the wrongs of those stronger than he. I cannot thank you enough. However, he flung up a finger, cutting the delighted dragon's praise short. I have several conditions. Refuse even one of them, and you'll be up a creek without a paddle. Fortisax blinked, somewhat taken aback. Why would I need to swim in a creek? I can fly. Yorska snorted behind him, the sound masked only by Maria's giggle. It's a saying, you big lummox. The wounded dragon laid back down with a baffled noise. I must admit, you creatures are most confusing. A giant iris swiveled his way once more. Name these conditions then, little Godric, and I shall listen. Several. He declared, not wavering for even a moment, for to do so promised disaster. First, when I find your precious Godwin, it might not be possible for me to resurrect him. You need to accept that much. And it was. If Godwin was as deeply intertwined with destined death as he believed him to be, it would be a great challenge simply extricating him from it, never mind bringing him back. Even with death's blessing, he had no way of knowing if a dead demigod's flesh would react to his presence. In all likelihood, he'd be in for the fight of his life. Been a while since he had a challenge. That might be fun. I agree to this. Fortisax bobbed his head. If you cannot save him, give him his rest. Second, Naruto held up another finger. I reserve the right to claim the strength he leaves behind, such as it is. Very well. The dragon grumbled, but heaved a sigh. I cannot contest such a claim. May you use his might for the betterment of the lands between. Godwin was the first of the demigods for a reason. Seizing his power would give him a rather significant increase. Not that he needed it, but better that he have it than someone else. The last thing he wanted was someone like Radon, oh gods forbid, Rykard, whom he'd already sent back to Raya Lucaria getting a boost. Like that. Third, up came the final finger. I reserve the right to deal with him whenever I please, and to that end, I'll need the help of at least one other demigod. Where are they now? Fortisax didn't like that one. He didn't need his superior senses. He could tell by the downright mutinous look in the old WRM's eye. Why do you wish to know their locations? I just told you, didn't I? He had, but he hadn't. Destined Death had only grown in power with the Sittering. It would not take kindly to losing a prize like Godwin. He'd something or someone to distract her, perhaps even trade. Outwardly he said none of this, and merely rolled his shoulders in a shrug. He rolled his shoulders in a shrug. I can't save your precious Godwin if I have to worry about my so-called family stabbing me in the back the moment I try. It only took a bit of prodding to sway him. If the Elden Ring has truly been considered, a council will be called. A god's meet in Lendl. The grin that followed practically split Naruto's face. Tell me more about this god's meet. Raiden feared for the future of the lands between. The Night of Black Knives was a foul and terrible event indeed. Its fallout felt even now. It had robbed them not only of Golden Godwin and rebellious Rani, but directly led to the Sittering itself, and in turn taken so much more. Now both Marika and Radagon were lost to them, gone missing in a world gone mad. The gods' meet had been called, and so he would go. Someone must put the kingdom in order. Someone strong. Someone bold. Someone righteous, with the heart of a lion. It must be him. It should be him. Rykard's skull ached abominably with every step, even after Mother's tender mercies, but his thoughts were quite clear on the matter. No one else was willing to make the strong choices, the necessary sacrifices. His siblings were no doubt preparing to wage war even now as he traveled to Lendl. The gods' meet was merely a pretense, a pretext for the war to come. Nothing more, nothing less. He must lead them into the new era, even if it meant consuming the old. Together they would devour the very gods. Miquella must be the one to rule. Malenia believed this with her whole heart. No one else was fit to lead them. None knew what the world needed but he. Only her twin did. He, who had already made a home for the broken and the forgotten, for the meek and the weak. Alas, her brother spoke little these days, thus it fell to her to communicate his whims and wishes to the world. Had decreed his intent to go to this God's meet, and so they would go. She would cut down any who dared to oppose him. After all, she had never known defeat. Alas, in her blindness, she failed to see her mistake the true threat among them. The world craved BLD. It was a fundamental truth only Mog could see. The old age was breaking and with it, opportunity beckoned. A new dynasty awaited. It would be his. All of it would be his. Let there be BLD. Usurpers, the lot of them. A flock of foul carrion come to pick over a body not yet dead. Pillagers, emboldened by the flame of ambition. Morgoth would not let them lay hand on the Erd tree. They shall not pass in the days that followed the Sittering. Every demigod descended upon Leyndell. The gods' meet they were calling it, just as Fortisax had said. Here they would meet in the capital to decide the fate of the lands between. Whether there would be peace or war. Naruto knew who would be attending in theory. Rykard and Radon, Miquella and Maelnia. Those who yet remained. Godric wasn't invited of course, but that was hardly going to stop him now, wasn't it? In the lands between, rules were meant to be bent, even broken. Hearts and mind would clash here. It promised to be heated at least, violent at worst. It was into this chaos that Naruto Godric arrived. Perhaps that wasn't quite the right word. Arrival implied he'd come with a small army ad trumpets bearing. He hadn't. He simply walked right through the gates. None challenged him. It was important pivotal really that he come alone, or at least be seen to come alone. Maria and Yorshka hadn't been happy about that, nor had little Teresa, but he was able to make them understand in the end by dint of sheer persuasion. They'd only put themselves in danger here, and skilled as he wasn't sure he'd be able to protect them if every single demigod turned on him at once. Even from the Erd Tree Sanctuary, he could hear their raised voices as he climbed the steps leading to the tree proper. Loud and angry shouts of dissent bickering with one another. Pathetic. Halt! A pair of draconic tree sentinels tried to bar his path, crossing their halberds together as he drew near. None may approach the Erd Tree while the demigods are in talks. A pale brow rose beneath his green hood. Time to play the part. Then it is well that I am one of them, no. One of sentinels glimpsed his face beneath the cowl and sputtered. You cannot be here, you have been banished. He needn't even raise a hand to silence them. A thought, the faintest pulse of destined death flung their way to grasp their necks, and they fell to their knees clutching their throats. He heard them choke out their last feeble breaths as he ascended the staircase, felt them expire now as he climbed ever higher, and spared not a care for them. High above the Erd Tree loomed now, close enough to touch. Cresting the last step, he glimpsed his kin from afar, seated in their thrones before the Erd Tree. Someone had dragged a massive, dusty round table out of storage and forced them to sit on all sides, the better to keep them from each other's throats. Of Marika and Radagon there was still no sign, but that didn't trouble him overmuch. What did surprise him was the sight of Morgoth and Mog at the table. Granted, he couldn't claim to know either all that well, but their presence at this so-called council came as a surprise. Yet for all their lineage the Omen brothers were no better than those they hosted. He could hear their voices raised even now in response to some slight or another. Honestly, they were like children. Brats fighting over scraps. Their lust for power was clear as day to him. Oh, they were quick to hide it behind their polite masks in public and their noble words, but here in private the facade was discarded, the ruse dropped, the curtain drawn back for all to see, and he saw through them all. There was a joke to be had there, he felt, but he was too mature to make it. He was only a few steps away and no one had noticed him, lost in their own little world as they were. He'd come in disguise of course, hood drawn down and leaning upon a gnarled staff, his axe carefully disguised as he limped forward, ever pretending to be the weakling he never was, never had been, never would be. Have I missed the party? His voice cut through the chatter like a hot knife. As intended, everyone turned to face him, all 6 demigods staring at him in silent confusion. Maelnia found her voice first. Why are you here? Why not, dear aunt? He feigned a mad laugh and continued to limp forward a pace despite her confusion. This is a council of demigods, is it not? A god's meet. I've come to take my seat. He chose the empty throne beside hers and claimed it, reveling in the annoyed noise she made. What are we talking about? She glowered at him. You were exiled. But he waved a hand. That's been rescinded. She made a grab for his hand, only to fail as he ducked. On whose authority? All eyes looked up to the Erdtree, including his own, though his gaze held a touch more annoyance than surprise. Pity. He'd had a wonderful retort prepared with Kurama, but the blasted twiggy trigid had swept it out from under him. For a moment the great gilded oak almost seemed to glow. Seemed he still had an in with the goddess that was the greater will. He could just imagine everyone's surprise. He'd remember their stunned face from this day until their last day. It would be but a prelude of what was to come. Enough. Morgott tapped his cane down, silencing the ripple of discord that followed. The Erdtree has spoken. He may sit among us for now. So kind of you, uncle. He smiled at them. Now, let's discuss terms. Miquella stirred enough to speak at last. Terms of what? Why, your imminent surrender, of course. How quick they were to laugh at him, even the ever-noble Radon looked away with a chagrined expression. Everyone was eager to dismiss him, all save Rykard, who seemed to remember some small semblance of what had transpired in Stormvale. Fear or pride held his tongue. But he didn't want to be sent back to Mommy Dearest with his tail between his legs again. How amusing. Mog wiped a bloody tear from his lone eye. It has been a long while since I heard such an amusing jape. Naruto felt something ugly curdle inside him. He shoved it down and mastered his temper. It's neither a jape, nor a jest, and not a joke. Steepling his finers, he laid them to rest beneath his chin and favored them each with a smile. Surrender, here and now, and I'll spare you. Radon found his voice at last. Spare us what, dear nephew? Why, death, of course. He turned that winning smile on him. I'm sure no one wants to die. Out of everyone here, you're the only one I'd feel bad about killing. The fool's gotten too big for his britches. His smile sharpened. Shall I remind you, Rykard? The praetor went pale beneath his gaze and clammed right up. Good boy. Kurama heaved a sigh in his head. You're enjoying yourself a little too much here, Naruto. He really was, but it was Miquella who rallied now, the eternal youth fixing him with a steely look. Do you have something to say, Godric? Perfect timing today just got better and better. As a matter of fact, do you know it's funny? He tapped a finger to his chin. You always preached about salvation for the weak. The forgotten. The lost and unwanted. You build a home for them. You lectured everyone about how we should save them. You extended your hand to the broken and weeping on the ground with a smile. It merely leaves me a single question. Where was my invitation, Miquella? His kin stiffened and made to speak. Naruto didn't give him the chance. When I was beaten and berated by Marika and left unmoving in the courtyard, why did you turn away? When I attempted to talk with you, why would your twin move her hand to her weapon and glare at a child? Melina went for her blade. That is quite enough out of I get it. He waved her aside as one might an annoying gnat, never once losing his temper. This wasn't the same as it had been with Fortisax, and he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. I didn't suffer enough, right? Look me in the eyes and tell me my life wasn't rotten. Show me where I was wrong. Tell me my suffering wasn't enough, Miquella. Oh, how his uncle squirmed good. He hoped those words kept him up at night. By what measurement do you judge hardship, then? He leaned forward, glaring at the younger demigod. Why was I excluded? Could it be that you lied? That you're a hypocrite? His head tilted, one ear seeked, waiting for a reply that never came. Is their misery simply convenient for you? Might it be that you, golden child Miquella, are no different than those arrogant gods of the Erdtree? He waited for the inevitable outburst, the spluttering of denials. It never came. Melinia's twins simply looked away and sulked. Disgust twisted the last of Naruto's smile into a sneer. And I pity you, for you thinking you're not. Mog absolutely bristled. How dare you speak ill of my dearest Miquella? Do shut up, Hornhead. The sane people are talking. He could sense everyone's animosity now, all directed at him. Too bad. So sad. They didn't enjoy being called out for their failures. Tough he certainly hadn't enjoyed the abuse they'd heaped upon them. The shoe was on the other foot now, as the saying went, and it promised to be a long, painful road for them. Morgott heaved a weary sigh. Is there a point to this diatribe, Godric? The point is that you have a choice, my lords. He unclasped both hands and stood before them, spreading his arms wide. Surrender or death. Nuerdrei buriau, nuhivaivo. Only the surety that is destined death. What will it be? Male Nia burst to her feet. I would sooner embrace my own boots than kneel to you. He smiled sweetly at her in return. Then you have chosen death. She looked like she wanted to stab him. Would you try? Peace Radon flung up a large hand and glared Male Nia into silence before she could find her nerve. Marika is not here, sister. Nor is father. With their absence it falls to us to lead the people in these trying times. We do them no favors by bickering amongst ourselves like this. We need proper leadership. Male Nia scoffed. And who is to say we should be led by you? Logic. The good general sat a bit straighter in his throne, the act of which rattled the table as he banged a knee against it. I have the largest territory. I command the greatest army. I am the strongest among us. And I have never known defeat. Morgott's cane tapped down again. Cease, we are here to talk. Your pointless squabbling avails no one, least of all yourselves. You speak well. Male Nia gave him a look of purest poison, but we all know it is you who wishes to rule. I dare say I shall do a better job than you and your accursed sibling. Out came her blade. Take that back, I shall not. Naruto tried not to laugh. Really he did. He failed spectacularly. Male Nia heard it and glared golden daggers at him. Do you think yourself above us, little Godric? I shall see Stormvale burn for this. Naruto rolled his eyes and slouched in his throne. Yes, by all means, attack one of the last bastions of pace and security in the lands between. That's sure to win hearts and minds. The people do not matter. Thunk. His foot stomped down on hers, denting her false foot. She glared at him for. Careful, little Godric. I have beaten you before and can easily do again. As you say, dear aunt. He smiled thinly. What would you say to a friendly wager? Our armies need not fight. Come to Stormvale and seek me out. Let there be bloodshed between us, but no other. Perhaps, Mog took the bait as he knew he would. It would behoove us to pluck the weed from the garden, as it were. Radon heaved a sigh. This means war. Male Nia nodded. War it is, then. As did Miquella. So be it. Rykard merely nodded. How quickly they banded together against him. Fools. They dug their own graves. So be it. Morgott turned to face him. Have you anything to say before this god's meat is concluded, Runt of the litter? Just one. He smiled and whistled, producing a single note. Heaven answered him with an almighty roar. Fortisax crashed down from on high in a bolt of red lightning, smashing into the center of them to obliterate the table and much of the ground beneath it besides. None had time to react. Their eyes had only just begun to widen when the corrupted WM smashed a hand down on the javelin, detonating it in a fiery plume. The devastation that followed was nothing short of catastrophic. Sitting at ground zero as they were, the demigods never stood a chance. Everyone was simultaneously blasted forth from their thrones and sent sprawling to the ground, badly burnt and bleeding. Naturally, the impetuous shadow clone Naruto had sent also evaporated within the fire and the flames. That left the original to drop down from the WM's back and survey the carnage. Mercifully, no one had perished. Pity. Fool of a boy. Morgott alone was still conscious amidst the carnage, and even then only just, leaning heavily upon his cane. Your treachery will not be forgotten, he snarled at him, horns broken, BLD running down his burnt face. This is a place of peace, you say? Naruto sittered his own illusion in an instant and towered over him, bringing the old omen up short. You all just agreed to band together against me. That doesn't sound like peace to me. Impudent. A roundhouse punch floored him entirely. What's wrong? From there he stomped on his throat with a snarl, leaving Morgott to grunt as a boot ground down on his windpipe, pinning him in place. You were talking a good game a second ago. His golden axe swept down, free at last, shimmering in the light of the sun as he placed both hands atop it. Then I blew your leg off. He ground his foot in further, drawing another groan from his helpless captive. What was that you called me, old man? I believe it was something along the lines of being a runt. Well, here's a warning from this runt. He leaned down to growl at him. The Erdtree will be mine. A vicious kick laid Maggot flat, knocked cold. He left him there to bleed out. Let the Erdtree decide his fate. He glanced to the tree, somehow still intact despite the massive explosion Fortisax had unleashed. A subtle tug nagged at him, and he found himself looking toward its entrance. As he looked on, the wall of bramble thorns peeled back, revealing a gleaming expanse of golden light beyond. For a moment he wondered if it would speak to him again as it had before. Nothing. He didn't know what he'd expected. He turned to leave. Seek me whenever you are ready. I await you, and only you. A shiver stole over him. When he was ready, he sighed. We're leaving Fortisax. The old WM heaved a sigh and looked to the stunned demigods, dazed where they lay. Are you certain? You will never have a better chance than this to kill them. Naruto looked back to the Erdtree, that golden arch which beckoned oh so sweetly. He could end it all now. Walk into the tree and take control. Become the new Elden Lord. Did he not deserve as much? Was tempting, oh so tempting to do just that, to simply kill his kin here and now. But that wouldn't satisfy him. Slaughtering them while they were unconscious would bring him no pleasure. It would be too easy. Male Nia and the rest of their kin needed to understand the error of their ways, realize their blunders. Only then would he be satisfied. Naruto looked about, idly noting Miquella and Moggs seemed to be stirring quicker than the others. Curious. Not that it was any of his concern. Time to make his decision. He walked away from the Erdtree, heard it seal itself behind him once. From there he stooped down, plucked the golden Valkyrie helmet from Melinia's head, and slung it over his shoulder. That would be sure to have her charging right at him, howling for his head besides. Trophy in hand, he sauntered away with a merry whistle and climbed atop Fortisax. Never known defeat had she. There were far worse things than losing a battle. Male Nia would know despair once they were through. Defeat was not enough for him. No. He was going to break her. Why are you laughing? Stop laughing at me. I'm sorry. Oh, wait, I'm not. I can't help myself. You think you know me. You think I languished for years thinking nothing of you, nothing but this moment. You delude yourself. Even now, you honestly believe that my entire reason for doing this, all of this, is because of you. Yet you ask why I laugh. You're not even a footnote. And now the perfect tool for my vengeance is right in front of us. Here, my hand. I never planned on killing you, but I will make you share my pain. A reference. I command thee. In the days that followed, Naruto settled into wait. His aunts and uncles would come for him. He knew it wasn't merely a matter of if, but when. They had to, if only to preserve their honor. With the aid of Fortisax, he had dealt them all a humiliating blow back in Lendl. In leaving them alive, he'd all but guaranteed that they would come howling for his head with the fury of 1,000 storms. But he wanted his family angry. Anger meant they wouldn't be thinking straight, that they would be distracted. They might even attack him all at once. That might be fun. He was looking forward to bringing the lot of them low, to breaking them, making them see the errors of their ways, and if they refused, to killing them once and for all. Destined death would see it done, one way or another. You see, their bullying wasn't the root of the problem. It was merely a symptom, the mindset that allowed them to do so. He was going to consider that mindset as surely as the Elden Ring itself. One such shard had come to him recently. He'd snatched it on his way out the capital. It shone in his chiseled eyes even now, a bright promise of things to come. Its blessing was a potent one, raising all his attributes that much more, enough to make him downright dangerous. This particular great rune was known as the Anchor Ring, found in the center of the Elden Ring. The irony of that wasn't lost on him. The first true demigods were the Elden Lord Godfrey and his offspring, the Golden Lineage. All others had come afterward. Fitting then, that he be the one to set things right. He was a shard-bearer now, through and through, and he wondered when his fellows would strike first. Would it be Radon? The oaf was certainly noble enough to announce his intentions beforehand. That one might actually face him alone. Melnia, maybe. She had sworn bloody vengeance against him after all. Miquella might be dragged into whatever sordid scheme she concocted, but then again she might not. She was overprotective of her twin, and her scarlet rot made her a viable threat, possibly even the most dangerous among the demigods. And speaking of twins, that brought him to the omens. Morgoth likely wouldn't leave Leyndell, unless provoked, but Mog seemed the sort to try something dastardly. He'd take precautions against that. Last but not least, there was Rykard. Hopefully he'd learned his lesson and would stay away. After the beating he'd given him, he'd surely know better hopefully. There was also an outlier of course, but he hadn't heard from him in quite some time. Wherever old Malekith was, he wasn't here. Matters for later, he supposed. All told, Stormvale was probably going to face a wave of attacks in the future. Yes, regardless of whose face it wore, conflict was inevitable. One way or another, his fellow demigods would come to Stormvale. He'd be more than happy to take the fight to them, but unfortunately he couldn't sally forth to meet any of his kin without looking like the aggressor or worse, leaving his home unprotected. And so it fell to him to make ready. Let it not be said that Godric was lacking. He studied his foes thoroughly. He exchanged letters with Rennala regularly, and so gained an insight into Radon's vaunted gravity magic alongside Rykard's blasphemous hexes. The knowledge proved illuminating. He researched both the outer gods and the lore of the Haligtree alongside the misbegotten and wretched that Miquella and Maelnia so seemed to favor. Legend had it a blind swordsman had sealed away a being bearing the scarlet rot before. Finding such a being proved impossible, but that research bore fruit in its own way. He even delved into the depths of the capital to find the remnants of a certain shackle. As to the other that one he bought off an enterprising bandit. Luck favored him, and he gained another follower that day. Patches was a sketchy sort, but he knew strength when he saw it and swore his loyalty sure enough when faced with the prospect of a fight. He seemed the sort to flee at any sign of real danger, but that suited him just fine. Morgoth and Mog's shackles would serve him better than the man ever could. The man would serve him better as a merchant and purveyor of information than a problem combatant. And besides, Alexander seemed to like him, which meant little Teresa liked him, and that, as they say, was that. Nor did he settle for merely recruiting. Over the span of the next 3 months, Stormvile's relatively archaic defenses were fortified tenfold. Parpates were mounted with heavy repeating crossbows and trebuchets. The walls both expanded and strengthened, the better to protect the town and its people from the coming battle. Knights were sent out on patrol regularly. Scouts prowled the borders of Limgrave. Really ought to change that blasted name once he won this war and he himself began to camp outside the castle with his guards, the better to respond to any crisis that might spring up in his absence. There were other matters of the realm to attend to, of course. The women and children would be evacuated to the inner keep for safety while the soldiers prepared. Stormvale could be rebuilt if any damage came to it. Innocent lives could not be so easily replaced. Meanwhile, he had 20 good men, elite warriors in his personal guard, with a ragtag army of 9,000 men and other mercenaries besides. 9,000 was a good number. He liked 9. His aunt and uncles outnumbered them at least 5 to 1, but they would have to face him here, on his turf, on his terms. And he'd stacked the deck in his favor. Remarkably, Maria and Yorshka proved surprisingly cooperative in that regard, almost eager to spend their nights together under the stars. He was sure those two were up to something, but he never had time to figure out what. Nearly 3 months after the gods meet, the scouts spied an army on the horizon. The promised attack had come. He was ready. The army prepared to march. Lord Godric, a pale man, swept the tent flap aside and stumbled inside, gasping for air. Lady Maelnia has made contact. She demands that you to meet her on the field of battle alone. Failure to comply will see the city put to the torch. A challenge. He recognized his steward and stood slowly in the shadows, sun glinting off his bare, broad. All right, fetch my axe, Gostock. And make sure Teresa is ready with our little surprise. His steward paused, not quite comprehending why he was so eager to answer. My lord, surely you don't intend to meet her demands. Naturally. This was Maelnia they were talking about after all. He couldn't wait to rub her nose in the mud. But of course. Bright eyes burned bright in the gloom, one sapphire, the other scarlet before he mastered himself. Don't you know it's rude to keep family waiting? The messenger winced and began walking backward, head still bowed. As you will, my lord. I shall see it done. Naruto frowned at him. One last thing before you go, Gostok. His steward tensed. Yes, sire. I found another serving girl warming my bed this morning. He pivoted to face him with a frown. I don't remember inviting her into my tent. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that now, would you? The silence was decidedly telling. Cheeky, sneaky little man. Gostok made for a good steward, but sometimes he just got the strangest eyes. So it was you stop throwing concubines at me. The pale man bowed deeper still. A lord must have heirs, sire. You are no exception. I understand that, but 7 is way too many. I'd be happy with 3 now. Get the servant scarpered. Maria and Yorshka entered as Gostok beat feet, the latter sparing a look for the poor fellow before they reached his side. The former held no such mercy, she only had eyes for him. Indeed, she stalked right up to him and stared him right in the eye. And oh dear. He knew what was coming next. Malnia is here. It was not a question. Naruto heaved a sigh. She is. I demand to fight her. Called it. Maria though. Maria, yes. His second planted both hands on her hips and leaned up to glare at him. I can beat her, you know I can. Could she? Maria was a veteran when it came to BLD arts and fire, both of which were Malenia's weakness. She was also skilled with a blade. He found himself tempted. It would be terribly entertaining to watch her beat down his aunt. Downright cathartic even. He could just picture the face of little Miss I have never known defeat when she got her rotten arse handed to her. I'd like that, he said at last, but I need you here, commanding the troops with Yorshka. You can't let Teresa out of your sight. She's pivotal to the plan. She wasn't budging, bless her. Yorshka can watch her. The draconic girl flinched at that. Hey, I'm not insulting you, dear. Maria rounded on her quickly. You're simply not built to be a frontline combatant. I am, and our Lord knows it. Quick as a flash, she whirled back to him and latched onto his arm. Let me go with you. She tugged insistently on his limb. I can fight. I can protect you. You know I can. His shadow winced. Maria speaks the truth, loath though I am to admit it. You mustn't go alone. It's too dangerous. Are you all right? No, I'm not. She granted him a pained smile and looked away. But thank you for asking. I will stay here, watch over Teresa and get stronger. She bit her lip, either unable or unwilling to meet his eyes. I am your shadow. I should be strong, not weak. I won't fail you again. He gave her head a quick pat. You haven't failed me. Never let yourself think that. Understood. Yorshka's tail began to wag happily. I will remember those words, my lord. Still, her pained expression stuck with him. He'd have to do something nice for her later to make up for it. On a whim, he leaned down and kissed her forehead. Yorshka squeaked, a decidedly soft sound, but adorable all the same. It reminded him of someone. Who was it? He couldn't quite recall what they looked like. Maybe his memories were beginning to blur together after all. He recalled so very little of his old life beyond the basics these days. Sometimes it worried him. He still remembered all his old techniques, but the faces and places had grown hazy. Indistinct. That's not your fault. He heaved a sigh. I know, Kurama. I know. Maria tugged on his arms, suddenly insistent. Let's be off. We've a beach to kill. All right. He sighed and with one last reluctant wave Yorshka's way, let his second draw him out the tent. I haven't decided if I'm going to kill her yet or not. He shrugged a shoulder when she made an annoyed noise. Killing her here might unleash the scarlet rot, and I'd rather not have that on Limgrave's doorstep. She scowled at him. Surely you're not going to just let her walk away after she brought an army here. Now, I never said that. Good. Her face closed down. That's good. In that case, since you already did it with Yorshka. Maria grabbed his wrist, took a deep breath for courage, tugged him down, and pressed her lips to his. Then she pulled away, leaving his mind utterly frazzled. Have I made my position clear, now? Naruto nodded, dumbfounded. She reached up to cup his cheek. I shall embrace you again when this battle is over, my lord, and you can give me your answer then. She sashayed away from him, hips SW&G with intent. Now let's be off. We've a beach to brutalize. Malnia saw him from afar. There he was. Her nephew limping in on a cane. She scowled at the sight of them, smug and insufferable as ever. She'd chosen a grassy knoll for their meeting, the better to let him see the army at her back. 60,000 soldiers and her clean-wrought knights besides, all ready and willing to wipe Stormvale from the face of the earth. It wouldn't be strong. She was confident in her warriors and the siege engines she'd brought besides. Stormvale might seem a tough nut to crack on the outside, but it, like any other castle, could not hope to stand up against a demigod. She would lead the charge herself if need be. After all, she had never known defeat. And yet despite that, Godric the Golden showed no fear. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the presence of her army, though he'd not brought his own. Dearest aunt, she knew he was putting airs on the moment he opened his mouth. How wonderful it is to see you again. To what do I owe the pleasure? Melnia didn't deign to respond, not right away. She'd make him suffer a bit before she did. Instead her gaze sought out his companion. There was that churl beside him again, his second who never left his side. What was her name? Maria. She was wary of this one. Not just as a woman, but a warrior. She looked capable. Granted, she'd never seen her fight properly back in Lane, but the truly dangerous ones seldom did now, didn't they? None had seen Godwyn fight since the Day of Dragons, and he had been the mightiest of them all until that night. Her hackles rose at the memory, souring her mood yet further. You were told to come alone. I'm weak, remember? His limpid smile immediately set her on edge. I need all the help I can get. I cannot help but fear for my life. He wasn't weak, else Morgott wouldn't have lost a leg back in Landel. He'd spoken little of the attack or his new bladed prosthetic foot, but really, who else would have had the motive to maim him thusly? Which begged the question, who was Godric, really? What was helping him? When had he concocted this elaborate ruse? Where had he gained all these resources? And most importantly, why had he done so? And most importantly, how had he hidden his strength from them for so long? Too many questions. They made her angry. Critical thinking had never been her strong suit. I don't see your shadow. Her lips pursed at the painful memory. They died. As did all who came in contact with her, sooner or later. His head bowed a little, pale hair lofting in the wind. My condolences. Melnia scowled. Those words rang falser than fool's gold. You don't sound sorry. Oh, but I am. His head bobbed. I'm sorry they had to put up with you for as long as they did. Death must have been a relief. Little Sit, she stepped forward. He was quick to step back. You were so brave before. Her mouth curled in a sneer. Where has that bravery gone? Look what's become of you. She scoffed at him, lips curling in a sardonic sneer. A coward crouching in his castle. Are you so afraid to face me in the field of battle? His gaze fell over her, calm yet intense. Look what I've risen above. His words burned worse than the rot within her. Pardon. Do I need to spell it out for you? You've always defined yourself by your own innate strength, Melnia. He shook his head slowly, tutoring at her as one might a naughty child. The power to kill, to dominate, to crush any who stand before you. You may think you have everything, but in truth, you have nothing. You are queen of nothing. Her blade flashed out, savaged the air between the three of them. And what do you have? His smile unsettled her deeply. And I won't let you take that away from me. There it was again. Unease. You speak as though you have something I don't. I do. He spread his arms wide. It's called perspective. You see only one path forward, one way out. Through me. One hand pivoted, palm held out to her. She was tempted to strike it off at the wrist, but his words rooted her before she could. Your darling Miquella told you to kill me, didn't he? She didn't give him the satisfaction of responding, and so he saw her truth. Thoughts of, it's always Miquella. Miquella this, Miquella that, Miquella. Oh dearest Miquella, tell me, do you even think for yourself anymore? Well, when you're not trying to kill your own nephew. Nonsense, she spluttered indignantly at him. I can think for myself. Then why aren't you? Godric titled his head. Of what possible use would my death be? Beside the fact that Miquella deemed it necessary for the greater good. It'll make me feel better. Maria sealed her tongue. Then you are lost. Melnia scowled at her. Quiet your betters are speaking. Steel slammed against her still outstretched sword, forcing her to jolt backwards in surprise as she hadn't in decades. Even as she leaped away, Maria lunged in, thrusting for her face and forcing her to parry. She caught a hint of euphoria in the younger woman's eyes as their weapons clashed, a glint of graceful glee in her smile before up became down and she crashed into the ground. Shame flooded her face. She'd only lost that engagement, but not the battle. Even so, it rankled her all the same. The only churl I see here is you, blade of Miquella. Maria's voice rang out rich with scorn, echoing clear and resplendent across the plains of Limgrave to mock her. My lord Godric should be left well enough alone. But you won't leave him be now, will you? Male Nia struggled to her feet, one hand over her face. You dare. Oh, I know very well. Even in her dazed state she heard the harsh song of steel sweeping her way. How your rot beckons so sweetly, only an honest death will cure you now. She blocked clumsily, to no avail. Maria sensed weakness and pounced like the huntress she was. In an instant their blades crossed once more, leaving the shorter woman to leer up at her. Such strength she disengaged and swept a kick at her feet, only for her foe to draw another weapon from her belt and move it in her face. Male Nia glimpsed a slender barrel, heard the CLCK of a trigger, realized her peril a second too late. Golden eyes bulged beneath her helm. With an ear-splitting crack, her world went white. Pain flared in her face and her golden helmet went flying with an awful clang. A howl of pain rent the air and in her dazed state, it took Male Nia a moment to realize it belonged to her. She crashed backward, clutching at her ruined ear. What was that? That, dear girl, was a pistol. Maria's voice cooed in her ringing ears as she swayed on her feet. An invention from my homeland, fueled by a lovely little thing called gunpowder. Do you like it? Unfortunately, it can only store a single shot, but Hugh is certain he can improve on the design. Now that I have your attention. As she looked on aghast, the swordswoman cast her spent weapon aside and took up her sword once more. With a fluid twist of the wrist, she broke the blade apart at the hilt, revealing a terrible dual weapon clutched in each hand. Her smile promised pain, death by 100 cuts. I shall liberate that pretty head from your shoulders. Godric heaved a sigh, but made no move to intervene, the coward. Maria, we talked about this. No, she snapped, the world a snarl. You promised me 5 minutes. It's only been one. The Lord of Stormvale sighed. Fine. You have 4 more. Don't play with your food. Was this a game to them? Male Nia righted herself with an effort, pride seething inside her. The rot writhed alongside it, but she forced it down, trusting in Miquella's needle to hold it at bay as it always had. She would not submit. She would win the day by the strength of her blade and nothing else. She could hear the murmurs of her soldiers. To unleash it here would devastate Stormvale, yes, but it would also destroy her allies. More than that, ascending would grant Godric no small amount of satisfaction. She could just imagine his smirk, his laughter as he mocked her. You had to become a goddess to beat me. How sad. No, she would not use that power, would not become someone else. She refused. You caught me off guard. She brandished her blade with a CLCK of her false arm and took on her stance. I underestimated you. That won't happen twice. Child, Maria giggled merrily. It will happen as many times as I wish. Perhaps killing her would break Godric. After all, steel filled her vision once more. This time she was ready for it. She pirouetted and parried, slashed her across the in vicious crosscut. Maria didn't even try to defend. She took the wound on her collarbone in stoic silence, uncaring as it cut her pretty pale skin, and lunged forward, savaging hers in a graceful counter. Male Nia grit her teeth too late, unable to choke back a pained cry. Fresh agony racked her body as steel kissed rotten flesh, tearing through her armor. Her fur mantle fell away, dragging her red cloak alongside it and much cloth besides to bear a rotten, calcified breast to the world. A gasp went up from her shoulders. Maria preened. Not so smug now, are we? Her temper. They fell upon one another in a storm of swords. Her rotten great rune allowed her to heal for every blow struck, but every wound Maria took remained. Her pale skin seemed almost ghost white now, deathly pale. And yet still she smiled. She was as relentless as she was terrifying, uncaring of her wounds so long as she managed to hit her. She found herself growing a wary respect for her even as they tried to kill one another. Was she truly mortal? She didn't fight like one. Unknown to pain, unflinching in the face of her wounds, undaunted by the challenge before her, she relentlessly fought on. It couldn't last. Eventually the tableau had to be broken, and it was. Male Nia flowed around a sweeping cut, parried Maria again with a ring of steel and slashed her neck. Here at last, Godric's second-in-command made a noise of pain. It wasn't a clean slice by any means or measure. She'd been aiming for the center of her jugular and only narrowly nicked the side by blind bloody bad luck instead. A normal warrior would have faltered, then fallen to BLD loss. Maria merely touched a hand to it with a sigh. Godric silked his tongue in mild admonishment. 2 minutes. Male Nia looked him an angry glance, then looked back to the dying woman before her. Do you realize now the extent of your folly? Atemikot. And you are just a mortal. Maria pulled her palm away, gazing at her scarlet fingers with a rueful expression. You're right about one thing. This is a bit of a problem now, isn't it? Her head tilted, blonde hair lofting in a sudden breeze, and with it came a sudden shiver of fear. I cannot defeat you in my current state, more's the pity. Her full lips quirked upward in a small, sad little smile. I had sworn never to use this again. Male Nia lunged. Maria whirled to meet her and drove both blades through her own stomach. Male Nia abandoned her charge in an instant, horrified by the sudden evisceration, unable to look away as the madwoman hunched over her weapons. Much to her dismay, Maria driving them deeper, all but forcing them up and out through her back. What manner of madness was this? Had she just killed herself? It didn't make a LCK of sense. Maria withdrew her blades in a shower of crimson, the weapons now coated with hardened yet full BLD. The very moment she did, her wounds began to close, sliding shut as said BLD flowed over them. There, that's better, don't you think? Her smile held an edge now. Shall we continue? For perhaps the first time in her life, Male Nia felt her confidence quiver. It was like looking at herself. No, an early version of herself. What are you? I suppose that's the question, isn't it? Maria shifted her weapon and touched a bloody hand to her face, uncaring of the stain she left behind. I could give you any number of answers. Half-lidded eyes regarded her most intently, one monster to another. After all, I used to be so very many things before I got on that boat. None of that made any sense. Speak plainly, or I shall cut out your tongue. Godric scoffed from the sidelines. As if you could. Truth is often stranger than fiction, isn't it, my lord? Maria laughed again, the broken giggle of a madwoman who had bathed in BLD buckets of it and been marked physically for it, if not mentally, a warrior who, like her, had never tasted the bitter sting of defeat. Call me a shade, a memory of Yarnum, a prisoner of the nightmare, now free. Her blade rose, FL King toward her in a smooth salute. I was the same as you once. Proud. Arrogant. So terribly sure of myself, until I lost it all. This world is my chance at redemption, my oath is my bond, and I shan't let you take it from me. Godric raised his voice. If you're the blade of Miquella, I suppose that makes me the reaper of Godric. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Her head tilted again with an awful crack as the grievous slice in her neck mended. I'm very good at killing, you see. I've made something of an art form of it. Let me show you. She dove at her with and Male Nia struck, only for her foe to vanish in a whirl of bloody mist. And she was behind her again. Her counter rattled her prosthetic arm and she felt something creak in her shoulder. She struck back and cut Maria deeply across the collarbone, only for the woman to laugh. Tainted vile blood splashed across her arm, and where it touched, rust began to spread. Male Nia balked and disengaged in a flurry of blows, warding her blade before her. Miquella had made this very arm for her to replace the one she'd lost so long ago. He'd said it was indestructible. Had he been wrong after all? And this woman, what was she? She was no demigod or empyrean, or even a shadow. She was mortal. How could she be this strong? Maria linked her weapons together once more and drew back for a lungino, a piercing move. You cannot possibly reach me. She did just that. A lance of vile blood crossed the distance in an instant to slam into her thigh. It pierced upward into her hip and kept going, simultaneously skewering her and sending her tumbling to the grass with a yowl of pain. She curled in on herself, gasping for air. It felt like her very BLD was boiling in her veins. The scarlet rot howled within her, leaking through her fingers to dribble drunkenly down upon the dirt. Grass withered and died where it touched. So that's it then. Maria turned her head and spat. That's the infamous Scarlet Rot. I expected more. Kill her, kill her. She'd absolutely kill her 1 minute, Godric chimed. Maria seemed to take that as a challenge, for she raised her blades at her sides and adopted an entirely different stance. Her feet left the ground as she seemed to hover in the air. BLD rose in the air around her. No, that wasn't quite right. She almost seemed to draw it inward, into herself, before expelling it in a violent explosion around her. Male Nia rocked back on her heels warily, watching her hated foe alight nimbly on the ground. Maria cast her hat aside, allowing her now blazing eyes to catch the light of the setting sun. No words were given, no petty remarks made. The hunter dove on her, blades blazing. BLD&Y was her BLD on fire. For she had caught fire, or rather her armor had. It both broke Melinia's concentration and caused her to stumble back, scowling furiously. She patted herself down as best she could, glaring hatefully at the increasingly spotty patches of pale splotchy skin that shone through the gaps. Her armor was fast becoming little more than threadbare rags now, barely preserving her modesty. Maria didn't give her time to do any more than that. She attacked with renewed ferocity, driving her back again with relentless dispatch. Her attacks had reached before, but now they carried with them a blazing aftercurrent. One chance Maria leaped into the air, preparing for her waterfowl dance. Maria mirrored her, matched her, bursting upright with such speed that the earth burst beneath her in a geyser of dirt and dust. They collided and all of Limgrave shook. Each strike met steel, then flesh, then steel again in a devastating spiral of destruction as they moved with greater and greater speed. This went well beyond a mere storm of swords. This was a dance of death, each trying to kill one faster than the other could heal. Something had to give. They both did at the same time. Melina's sword found Maria's even as the rapier tickled her skull. Someone slammed down between them, conjuring a plume of smoke. Male Nia felt something push the two of them apart like a pair of naughty children. She landed HRD on her rear, even as Maria stumbled back in a swearing rage. Fury mounted within her as well. Who dared interrupt their duel? Who dared deny her the sweet taste of victory? She would have their head. She would. Time's up, Maria? Male Nia whirled, incredulous as Godric walked through the dust, leaning upon his cane. Maria looked like she might protest, but subsided at his glare. Very well. I bow to your will, my lord. Male Nia saw her chance for what it was and backpedaled quickly, reaching for her helmet only to remember she dropped it. She found it sprawled on the ground not a yard away, caked in BLD and dust, one of its two wings blasted clear off by Maria's eldritch pistol. She'd need to have a new one made. Donning it now would only bring her shame. She turned away from it to glower hatefully at her nephew instead. You think she can defeat me? I'm tempted to let her finish the job, but no. Godric rolled his shoulders, divesting himself of his green cloak. He stood proud, pale skin gleaming in the sunlight. She's had her fun and embarrassed you. Now she's going to watch you fall. Oh dear. Male Nia lifted her chin and tried to put on a brave face despite her wounds. I have never known defeat. You're about to. He spread his arms wide. Bit of a bad day for you, isn't? Watch closely now. The weak, helpless boy before her sittered like so much glass. So he'd been an illusion after all. For only the second time in her life Maria found herself looking up at someone. He was nearly a head taller than her, not towering like Radon, but large and well-built all the same. Gone was that pale wraith. In his place stood a monster straight out of myth, lazily leaning upon not a cane, but a mighty golden axe. Her confidence fell cured like a candle in the wind. Small wonder Rykard and Morgott had lost to this. Still, size clearly wasn't everything, and his second was thoroughly exhausted. She just had to close the gap and be done with it, surely. Even wounded as she was, she at least had a chance catch. Something sailed through the air. Male Nia snatched at it feverishly, stiff fingers fumbling. A golden flask awaited her, filled with red liquid and sealed by a wax stopper. She squinted at it, then back to him. What is this? A flask of crimson tears. Godric waved a large hand at her. That should heal you, despite your great rune. Drink up. Have you lost your mind? She balked at him, made incredulous by his sheer stupidity. This might be your only chance to defeat me. Even so. He crossed both arms before his broad teeth. I want to crush you at full strength. His smile made her shiver. I'm gonna take you. A hand rose before her, clenching into a fist. And then I'm gonna break you. Nothing else will satisfy me. So you say? She uncorked the flask back and drank deeply. Whatever it was, the concoction was strangely sweet. If he was trying to poison her, he would be disappointed. The scarlet rot warded off all toxins. After all, one couldn't be poisoned twice. Her wounds began to mend, slowly but surely as she drained the contents down to the last drop. Her heart hitched in hers and the world lurched for a moment, bringing with a brief feeling of dizziness. She shook, cast the now empty flask aside and turned to face him. Her blade sang as she took up her stance. Are you prepared to die? Focused as she was, she missed Maria's slight smile. But that's a story for another time. You once told me to LCK your boots. Her nephew tittered softly. I'll take a page out of your book. His axe rose. I command thee kneel. Never you will, by the end of this. He shook his head, setting his long hair swaying, whiskered cheeks dimpling in a small smile. Just wait, you'll see. In that moment, Nia nearly unleashed the rod upon him. It was only her brother's words that held her back. Miquella had told her not to bloom. So she wouldn't. She would not disappoint him, not after he'd given her so much. She would win this battle, burn Stormveil to the ground, and make him proud. Miquella was all that mattered. He was the only hope for the lands between. The thought centered her. Breathe. Calm yourself. Watch his legs for movement, and there she led with a thrusting lunge that carried her forward, intending to pierce Godric clean through and be done with it. She missed. Impossible. She couldn't have missed. He was 3 feet in front of her. Where her stomach opened in a shower of beam, Nia balked and clutched at it to keep her organs inanely for her hand to grace her unharmed stomach. There was no wound. None at all. Had she imagined it? Somehow. What's wrong? Godric tilted his head, eyes dancing. We're just getting started. Focus. Nia took a step forward, drawing well within his striking range. She would close the distance and her prosthetic arm came flying off in pieces of porcelain alongside the other half of her body as her torso split in two and flew apart. Nia kicked backward with a yelp, only to find herself whole once more. Godric kept right on smiling. You're not going to approach me. No more tricks. Nia scowled and surged forward. Her eyes met his as his axe swept down with murderous speed. She tried to block but her blade sittered and his weapon passed through, unimpeded to strike true. Her head flew from her shoulders, shedding hair and scarlet blood as it tumbled through the air. Her skull bounce struck the ground and bounced once before rolling to a halt at his feet. She gawped up at him, mouth open in mute horror, golden eyes staring blankly back at him as the light faded. Then she was back again. And she understood. Her own death. That was what she'd seen. She'd instinctively sensed it, watched it play out in her mind's eye. 3 times. She'd seen herself die 3 times in as many seconds. This was different from Maria. Somehow, instinctively, she knew she was facing an altogether different beast. Not an even match, but something more. Gulping, she dared another step, eliciting the tiniest of twitch from him. He shifted just so, and she saw death in his eyes. She braced herself for it, felt the fear wash over her, and willed her imagination to be silent. Her every instinct was shrieking at her now, howling at her to fly, to flee, to retreat, but that would mean accepting defeat. She managed to stand her ground, but only just. Her nephew wasn't nearly so patient. If you won't make the first move, then I will. His axe swept in and she parried low, sparks spraying between their weapons. Her already rusted metal prosthesis creaked horribly, but she managed to wrench herself aside and send her slender blade racing up the haft of his weapon. His lips parted in vulgar glee and her world inverted and an open palm crashed into her stomach. A brief flash of blue light was her first warning, followed by the keening whine of a technique she'd never seen before and then Rasengan. Pain, oh gods, the pain, make it stop. That single snarling spell was worse than Maria's burning bill. 1,000 times more painful and powerful. Breath burst from her lungs as she tumbled backwards, head over heels, then arse over elbow, down the hill toward her army. The rest of her armor, what little remained after her tussle with Maria, was summarily shredded in the tumble, leaving her clad in naught but the awful growths of the scarlet rot. For once, Melnia found herself inordinately grateful for her curse. The awful calcification of her body preserved some small semblance of her body's modesty, though it did nothing to conceal her shame. Was this what Godric wanted from her? To see her naked and afraid, cowering before him. She would not bow. She would not submit. Not to him. Never to him. She tried to stand, only to realize she was missing an arm. Her right arm. Confusion gave way to hoarse horror. Her prosthesis had gone flying in the tumble, taking her blade with it. It landed at her feet in a dull clatter of dented metal, startling her terribly. Godric loped down the hill, face carved from stone. Pick it up. Melnia hesitated. Fear wormed its way into her heart. She stepped back. No. Godric wasn't having it. You don't get to run. He kicked the limb her way. She heard her followers cry out in the distance, saw several of them perish now as a smiling Maria carved a line of burning BLD barrier between them and her. There would be no aid on that front from her army. Not that with that abomination standing guard. Her pride wouldn't have allowed it in any case. Godric hummed. Be a dear and keep them there, won't you? She smiled over her shoulder at him. Of course. Melnia stilled. So that's how it was. Fight or die. Those were her choices. If that was to be it, she snatched her arm up, dragged it to her shoulder, and locked it into place once more. Godric smiled. That's the spirit. They collided once more. This time she let his weapon sweep down, embedding itself in the ground. She raced up its length and flew at him with a snarl. Surely her waterfowl dance would put an end to him. He was too close to evade. She was right on that account. Godric didn't dodge her slashes. He tanked them. Slow, he straightened up under the barrage of slashes, teeth flashing brilliantly in the light of the waning sun. A bead of sweat ran down her brow. She flung herself into the second leap with great vigor, blade blurring. He laughed at her, uncaring of the wounds that opened up all over his body. Sloppy with her third and final leap, she chopped down at him in a snarl. Sad one last flurry of slashes and then he was through, grinning like a lunatic, uncaring of the countless shallow cuts crisscrossing his upper torso. An open palm swept up, caught her face and slapped her clean out the air like an annoying gnat. She struck the ground and kicked off it, only for his fearsome shadow to fall over her once more. Why did she hear boss music all of a sudden? Wasn't she supposed to be the boss here? His almighty axe swung so strong it physically caught fire before it struck her. She had no choice but to block. Unfortunately, doing so forced her down on one knee, braving her blade with both hands just to stay alive. Down he struck again and again, forcing her other leg down, kneeling now against the relentless barrage of one-handed blows. The ground cratered beneath as she was forced lower and lower to the ground with each strike. She found herself reminded of a child's game she'd once seen when she was small, where one would smash down a series of wooden pegs with toy hammer. She realized what she'd done, what she was doing, what position she was in, a heartbeat later. Whoa. Her nephew laughed at her. It was a deep, boisterous sound that set her BLD boiling. Would you look at that? You're kneeling. Shame flooded her face. Not by choice, yet you still kneel. In you, she slashed upright, narrowly deflecting another swing of his axe. It gave her time to scramble to her feet. I won't let you win. Godric tilted his head. Is that it? What? You really think you know me, don't you? He lowered his axe, thumbed a thin line of BLD from his lips and scoffed down at her. You honestly think I languished for years thinking of nothing but you, nothing but this moment? You built me up as a monster in your head. A bitter chuckle escaped him. To me, you're barely a footnote. Up came his mighty hatchet, hanging over her head. And now the perfect tool for my vengeance is right in front of us. I never planned on killing you, but I will make you share my pain. His battle axe was upon her in an instant. She dodged it. Not so the attack that followed. His boot caught her in the ribs and launched her back up the hill, away from her army. Classic demigod arrogance. He walked up the rise after her, hands clasped behind his back as she struggled for air on her hands and knees. You think that if you hit something really strong, it'll go away. That's a weakness all of Marika's children share. Even myself, to some extent. Cruelty is not born, it is taught. A hand swung down, seized her by the hair, and hoisted her upright. She whined in pain, to no avail. His grip was ironclad. That was why I endured your torment. He hissed at her, snapping in her face. I wanted to hope. I wanted to believe. I wanted to give you all every chance to change, and you squandered them. Only Runni listened. And we all know what happened to her now, don't we? Male Nia finally got her breath back and slashed at him frantically, bringing her blade around backward to cut her hair and denying Godric his grasp. Her terrible tormentor didn't even bat an eye as she kicked off his tea and launched herself away. You were told that might makes right, that you're destined to become so much more. But you're not. His head shook in mild dismay. Not really. You're a tool for your brother. You'll be cast aside, like all the rest. She rushed him with a scream. Godric whistled and his axe came hurtling in, slamming into the ground beside him, forcing her to abandon her headlong rush and back off. He hefted the hatchet as though it weighed no more than that a feather. Do you honestly think he loves you? Of course he didn't he. Her face burned. You know nothing, I know everything here. At last the mask slipped and she saw the beast within, the rage he kept so tightly leashed, snarling just beneath the surface. I know what's going to happen here. I know how all this is going to end. He raised a hand and held out 3 fingers, counting down one by one. The supplication of male Nia. The whimper of Radon. The death mule of Morgoth. Felled by their own hubris. I know what Miquella's plans are, and I know exactly what Mog wants. His smile turned ugly. Or should I say whom? Male Nia ran a hand through her hair, mourning its lack of length and the stray strands falling through her fingers. Her cut had been a rough and ragged one, leaving the scarlet tresses just shy of her shoulders. She'd loved her long hair. It would take years to grow it back, assuming the rot let her. For that, she hated Godric more than ever. What are you getting at? You really have no idea, Her nephew barked out a laugh. It's been so long, and my path has been so dark, darker than I would have liked, but I survived. I endured because I saw what was coming. They won't. Something in his words made her shiver all over. What are you? Many things. Godric's smile was colder than the mountaintops of the giants. But for you, retribution. She stepped back and assumed a trembling, exhausted stance. I've defeated you before, and I can defeat you again. He tilted his head yet further. Don't be so certain. I was holding back there. Let me show you what destined death tastes like. Male Nia twirled, slamming her blade down in a spiteful attempt to take Godric's foot. He sidestepped and she realized her mistake too late. She was wide open. Suddenly there were 3 of him, 2 doppelgangers appearing in a plume of smoke on either side of her. She struck at one, only for another to swing at her exposed flank. Rotten Beal flew through the air and agony seared down her spine as she danced backward to disengage. Errors were made. 2 axes struck her from left, then right, smashing down into his collarbone. One of them found her prosthetic arm. It buckled with a tortured groan of metal. She choked out a gasp and tumbled away. What is this? Not so fun when the shoe's on the other foot now, is it? Godric shunted her blade aside, grabbed her by the throat and slammed her down to the dirt. Teresa now mighty roots burst from the ground around male Nia, snaring her arms and legs, no, more than that, crushing them. She struggled mightily against them to no avail. They were strong, far stronger than a mere tree had any right to be. That brief moment of inattention cost her most dear. Her false arm was torn away from her in an instant with a horrible squeal of grinding metal, followed by the prosthesis of her legs, leaving the stumps of her limbs flailing uselessly. All that remained was her natural left arm, and that was nowhere near enough to free her. Not without a weapon. No, she cried out and kicked her mangled legs at him, to no avail. Unhand me, I am male Nia, blade of Miquella, I have never known defeat, do you hear me? Never release me. Godric did no such thing. He simply held her there until the roots tightened around her torso. She struggled one last time, body bucking, back arching, to no avail. Imprison her below, Godric commanded his clones with a dismissive wave. Let her drown in her misery. Take her to a cell and leave her to rot. His doppelgangers reached down and took a hold of her, leaving those powerful tree roots to fall away. Blind, animalistic panic set in. No, not like this. She refused to go like this. Miquella shall avenge me. You'll see there will be nowhere for you to run. Call for him. Then he planted his axe into soil and rested both hands upon it. Oh wait. His doubles dropped her to the dirt unceremoniously, echoing his words. Satisfaction flowered within her, dark and heady. She'd show him he'd see she and Miquella were bonded as only twins could be. She had but to call out to him and he would appear, coming to her side in an instant. She had hoped to spare him of this slaughter, but victory was all that mattered. Miquella, she called to the empty air. She was met with empty silence. Her heart hitched. Brother. Only the wind answered. Answer me at once, crickets chirped. Godric shook his head. Do you see now? Your brother has abandoned you, queen of nothing. No liar, I hear you, Melnia. Her nephew looked up, surprised. Well, color me surprised. Fresh hope surged through Melnia. Come to me, I need your help. I am sorry, sister. His voice rang with sorrow. Sacrifices must be made. Sacrifices. Surely he didn't mean her. Nay, surely not. He couldn't be that cruel. Brother, you have fought long and strong in my stead, all without giving in to the scarlet rot. I had hoped you might triumph, but it seems it was all for naught. But she faltered as she hadn't since she was a small child. You have to help me. You're my twin, my brother, and this pains me more than you can ever know. His voice remained soft as a whisper. But sacrifices must be made for the greater good. You will be reborn in the new era I create. Cleansed, perfect whole. This will all seem a bad dream. There was something in the way he said that last part, a chill that made her blood run cold. Go to your rest now, Miquella. Melnia heard a faint clink. Something metal landed at her feet. Baffled, she looked down and beheld the fruit of her brother's bitter betrayal. The needle. Miquella's unalloyed needle, painstakingly moved into her flesh so long ago, now crumbled away before her very eyes. She grasped at it with fumbling fingers, only for it to fall apart in her hand. And with its passing, Melnia felt the accursed scarlet rot began to stir within her of its own accord. Contained for so long, it had grown and now it was unleashed. Not naturally as intended, but in a single towering wave. She was powerless to stop it, much less contain it. Godric's doppelgangers faltered in the face of it, vanishing into plumes of smoke. The grass shriveled and withered beneath her feet. She could feel her vision going red, but she couldn't stand up, couldn't run. She was far too wounded and much too weak, her artificial limbs gone, and unable to support herself on a single arm. No, she clawed at herself with her remaining limb. Brother, please, her voice peaked in a scream. I don't want this Godric tutate above her. And they call me cold. Farewell, nephew. Miquella's voice rang out above one last time, not even addressing her. It pains me that we could not come to an accord. Her nephew lifted his head to stare skyward as her body began to writhe. This won't kill me. You overestimate yourself. And you underestimate your stupidity. He silked his tongue. You're throwing away a loyal ally, and for what? On the off chance that this might slow me down. She is not the first Melnia. Nor will she be the last. In the end, she will thank me for this. Her thoughts fizzled out. Not the first. Melnia felt something snap deep inside her. It felt like her mind. She could feel it fracturing, breaking, sittering when her will broke. The scarlet rot rose yet further, coiling around her in a spiral, petals red to unfurl. Her second bloom wouldn't be a normal one. Her body might even be destroyed. The rot had been forestalled for far too long. Or perhaps it was simply disappointed in her failure as a vessel. Even now she could feel herself crumbling, her thoughts folding inward. Fascinating. The detached curiosity in Miquella's voice hurt more than any reject could. I had wondered what might happen when she broke. A sob tore out of her. How could you? Just give in, sister. It will be less painful. Farewell. Melnia stretched a rotting arm toward Godric. Help me, her nephew didn't respond. He was too busy glaring at the sky. Her panic mounted, rising with the rot. Should I bloom here, all of Lingrave will perish, still nothing. He wouldn't even look at her. Rotten tears ran down her cheeks. You're going to let me die, aren't you? Of course he would. Why wouldn't he? He owed her less than nothing. He loathed her. He'd all but said as much. Godric had been right after all. She truly was the queen of nothing, wasn't she? Once she held power. Now she only felt pain, and soon enough, not even that. In the end, she was a pawn. She'd always been a pawn. A sacrifice to be cast aside. Warm arms enfolded her tormented torso. Male Nia jolted. As such, she was wholly unprepared for what came next. Godric picked her up and tucked her against his knee. She made a noise of belated confusion, even more so when he knelt and held her closer still, shielding her with his titanic body. He was so very warm. Warmer than she'd thought she'd be. It was the first time someone had dared to hug her in a century. Now you know how I feel. His voice was a cool balm against her ragged nerves. Betrayal sucks, doesn't it? She hadn't expected such kindness in her final moments. And yet he hated her. Did he not? Was he really going to die here with her? The thought should have brought her visceral pleasure, and yet release me. She tried to push him away but couldn't with only one arm. Have you no consideration for your life? You'll die. Done that before. He granted her a pained smile. Didn't stick. Her world fizzled. Leave me please. His arms tightened around her. Not a chance in hell. Male Nia whimpered. How absurd it was that her most enemy showed her more kindness than her own betraying BFRD of a brother. That kindness broke her. Everything she'd thought about him was wrong after all. Mother had been wrong, and more fool she for letting Marika pour poison in her ear. Godric wasn't the runt of the litter. He was the greatest of them all. And now he would die with her. I'm sorry, Godric, I'm so sorry. She clung to him with her good arm, all that was left to her, holding on for dear life. I'm sorry for everything. Great heaving sobs racked her body as she buried her head in his knee with a low wail. For all of it, every bit of it. Please forgive me. Godric whispered something in her ear. 3 little words. Her eyes widened as she heard it. With that her self-control sittered and the bloom burst from her back in a wretched silmix, showering the world in scarlet rot. Voices cried out in horror around her. She heard Maria's horrified scream and couldn't even feel any satisfaction for it. This was the end. Everything was over. It was all of it, finished. She'd taken too much damage and would surely crumble away in his arms. They died together. At least she wouldn't go to the void alone. Something warm graced her lips. Dazed as she was, it took male Nia a moment to realize what was happening. Godric had pressed his mouth to hers. He tilted his head now, deepening the embrace further. And with his embrace, she felt the rot drawn out of her like poison from a bad wound. First it was tugged from her core, to her teeth, then to her lips and into him. He drained it from her as one might water from a broken sieve. All around them, the scarlet Ionia sputtered and died, leaving the hill blackened and charred, but Limgrave untouched. Nor did Godric stop there. He took all her poison and pain and powerlessness into himself, draining every last drop of scarlet rot from her body. And as he did, male Nia could have sworn she heard something scream deep inside her, the angry wall of an outer god howling imprecations as it was sucked clean out of her into him. By the end, it almost sounded like it was begging, trying to bargain with him, pleading for mercy. Godric drew back, breaking their lip lock, and the begging voice died with a raspy whisper. He released her gently, setting her down on the ground. There was no pain. Why wasn't there any pain? Male Nia propped herself up with her good arm and blinked down at herself, bulking now as the calcified bits of her body began to heal, bearing the nakedness of her crippled form to him in its entirety. Her mangled limbs began to itch, and she resisted the urge to scratch at them in a daze. She knew she should be panicking, but she was too stunned to be embarrassed by it all, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. The scarlet rot was gone. She could no longer feel it within her, not even the tiniest of whispers. For the first time in her life, she could move without pain. Her savior loomed over her, shining like the sun. Here in this moment, she felt he'd earned his epithet. Godric the Golden indeed. She balked at him. Your strength extraordinary. What have you done? What did you use? Destined death. Her fellow demigod exhaled in a plume of red steam. I used it to draw the scarlet rot inside me. He thumped his Izzy with a fist, and killed it. How could one possibly slay the essence of an outer goddess? Death was the great equalizer, she supposed. But still, if he could do that to a deity beyond the stars, what could he do to her? More importantly, what was to become of her now? Yes, she'd apologized to Godric. Meant it even. Did that excuse a lifetime or torment? It did not. Nor did it change the fact that she was now effectively powerless without the scarlet rot. She remained an Empryon, yes, albeit a crippled one. One arm and no legs. Her prosthetic limbs were lost to her now, all but destroyed in the battle. She didn't qualify as a proper combatant anymore. Without them, without her sword, she felt weak and vulnerable as she'd never been before. She was entirely reliant on his mercy, and they both knew it. Godric considered her for a long moment. Melnia quailed under his gaze. "Are you going to kill me?" "Should I?" He seeked his head, rather reminding her of a fox. "That depends entirely on you." She wanted to live. The realization surprised Melnia. Despite the bitter betrayal she'd suffered, she didn't want to die just yet. If anything, she wanted answers. Why had Miquella cast her aside? Why had he turned on her in her moment of need? Why had he abandoned her? It wasn't like him to be so callous. The link between them had been broken, but she remained determined to find her twin, find him, and have her answers. And if he'd... You say weakness is a sin. Perhaps it is. But we are all born weak, are we not? How else can we become strong? For that reason alone, this so-called runt of the litter should be feared above all else. That boy is a most cunning creature, a child who is seen as weak. Everyone lets their guard down around him, but in truth, they are the prey while he is the wolf, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment is coming. Make no mistake, it is coming. Runt of the litter, do you fear death? Do you fear that dark abyss? All your deeds laid bare, all your sins punished. I do. I'm absolutely terrified of it. Makes my very soul quiver, you know. I don't like the idea of dying. Who would? Death is the end of your journey. No one knows what awaits on the other side, what the afterlife is like. Not me. Not you. Not any of us. To be honest, I don't want to know. Ignorance is bliss, as they say. Try not to think about it. So yes, I'm afraid of death. But death fears me. You see, the Reaper doesn't want to deal with me just yet. He knows we wouldn't go quietly into that good night. And he'd be right. No way in hell would Kurama and I just roll over and croak. Heroes never do. So the big guy offered us an escape. His blessing. A chance to postpone the judgment assuming we survive. Mortals are cruel. Why would demigods be any different? Go ahead. Send me now. I'm ready. Let's give this one last go, shall we? One more time around. Make me the runt of the litter. A descendant. Godwyn the Golden gazed upon the babe before him, nestled in a MWF's arms. 'Twas a weak fledgling, only a few months old. Whiskered cheeks and faint silver hair. The BLD of the golden line was weak in him. Fleeting. He did not sniffle, nor did he cry. He made not a sound. Were it not for those bright blue eyes, he might have thought dead already. Perhaps he yet would. His mother died in childbirth, my lord. The MDWF stood before him, resolute. He is your BLD, however distant. I knew not what to do. A pity. Such a terrible pity. It was a shame he'd lost his mother in childbirth, but he could not raise this boy. He had neither the time nor the faith in himself to do so. Not any longer. Godwyn waved the woman away with a lie instead. I have no need of such a child. Give him to another. The doughty woman stood her ground. There is no one else, my lord. The queen said if you would not take him, I am to dash his skull against the stones. Guilt gnawed at him. He wanted to say mother knew better, that she would never do such thing, but he knew the truth. Marika took a dim view on kinslaying, no matter the circumstance. Any such a child born at the cost of their mother be declared cursed and fit for killing. To be declared kinslayer at such a young age did not bode well for the boy's fate. To die before they even truly knew the world. Godwyn stilled at the thought, finding it too much to bear. Has he a name? Godric Vimod. It was one of the last things his mother said. He'll be the runt of the litter. Indeed he would. A shadow of greatness. A mere glimmer of gold that could be. His brothers and sisters were ruthless. They did not take kindly to competition, and even less kindly to his status as firstborn. No demigod had sired any children of their own save he. Their arrogance, their fear would not allow it. Any aid he rendered the boy would only further antagonize them toward him. Little Godric would have to fend for himself. He'd be forced to fight for every inch. It would be a brutal struggle. Hesitation would be defeat. If he faltered for even a moment, he would die. Father would never have allowed such. Had he been here, he would have stayed Mother's hand. Alas, great Godfrey was no longer here, having been exiled to the Badlands long ago. He might one day return, but such a return was far off. And there was just something about this boy. He could sense the infant's regard. Feel it watching. A mere babe shouldn't be able to do that. And it was still silent. Almost deathly so. Runt of the litter. He dared to touch the child's head and was rewarded with a fearsome scowl. Funny you should say that. In my eyes, the runts are often the ones you must watch out for. They fight the hardest. Bark the loudest. Yes, the runt you speak of has much to prove. He closed his eyes and stretched out his senses. The blessing would suffice. From the greatest to the lowest. With luck his descendant wouldn't notice. I grant you the blessing of the sun, little one. May your spirit shine bright. Nothing happened. Godwin tried to bless him yet again, only to achieve a similar result. The spell was sucked down and away into the babe before him. No, that wasn't quite right. He had felt the spell settle on his descendant, but it soon withered and died. The baby gurgled happily, unaware of it all. Godwin granted him a keen look. Realization dawned. I see. He'd need to keep Fia away from this boy until he was grown. She'd be all over him. Or perhaps that was what he needed. All were equal before death. From the greatest of gods to the merest of mortals. And this boy was blessed by death itself. That ruinous specter that supposedly been removed from the Golden Order now lived in this pale wisp of a boy. If he'd realized it, his siblings surely would in time. Mother was likely already aware of his condition, likely why she'd not bothered to kill him outright in the first place. Someone would have to protect the boy. It could not be him. He hadn't much time left. His brow furrowed, considering. Do we still have that girl who hails from Yarnum? Maria, I believe her name was. The MDWF bowed. Yes, my lord. Is she still adrift? She is, then what? Of course she was. Poor thing had lost all but the clothes on her back. A curious oddity from across the sea, an enigma hailing beyond the lands between. She lacked purpose, and so he would give her one. A child to raise a child. The irony wasn't lost on him. She'd have some small semblance of help through the servants, but this would be her burden to bear. Bring her here. She is to be his attendant henceforth. Little Maria would look after him. The words were said. The deed was done. Let it not be said that he did not look fondly upon his descendants. He did not have much time left before he lost himself. The years to come would take more from him still. This was the most he could do. My lord. Godwin smiled softly at the MDWF. See to it that he lives until she arrives, won't you? He had neither the time nor the patience to raise a descendant. Though they would never truly meet, he wished him well. All were equal in death, after all. The gardens were lovely this time of year. Grand golden roses dazzled in the afternoon sunlight, rising from trimmed bushes to thread their way around ancient architecture twinning with green vines. This was a place of beauty and peace, but also life and death. There was a certain duality he found in that. Some thrived in the vine's grasp, while others choked, spilled their seeds and died. From those seeds yet more life grew, and on it went, round and around, an endless sequel of life and death. Such was the nature of the lands between. Naruto Godric found it darkly amusing. Why wouldn't he? It was the nature of both gods and man to shun that which they didn't understand, to cling to the familiar and reject the strange, to cast out that which does not fit the mold. Death was but one facet of that. Anything that did not conform to the beloved tenets of the Golden Order was to be loathed and reviled. That which truly forsaken her, then there was only one path forward. Revenge. She would start with revenge. It would serve as her purpose for now. Male Nia dragged herself upright, propping her body up unsteadily on her remaining limb. It was a terrifying thing to try and interact with the world without one's legs. Everything seemed so much bigger from down here, somehow. She supposed she'd have to get used to it in the interim. Was this what defeat felt like? She'd thought it would gall her. Burns. It did none of those things. It felt freeing. Like a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. She understood. Everyone experienced defeat at least once in their life. It only made them stronger. The only way out was through, as they say. She knew what she had to do, what she should do, what she must do, if she wanted to preserve even the smallest scrap of her honor. I swear myself and my army to you, Godric. She bowed her head to him and knelt as best her mangled leg stumps would allow, broken though I am. Let me be your blade, as I was for Miquella, and I will not fail you. He was not the monster she'd thought he was. She saw that now. He'd thrashed her, yes, but only after she'd come looking for a fight. He would have been well within his right to kill her and still could. She dearly hoped he wouldn't. There was nothing she could do to stop him from bringing that battle axe down on her head. She couldn't even use her arm and defend herself for fear of falling over. All she could do was raise her head, look him in the eye and hope that whatever he did, it would be quick. Her poor battered heart couldn't handle all this anticipation and anxiety. His eyes met hers. The world held its breath, awaiting his judgment. And then, with a shrug of his shoulders, all right. Just like that, Godric crouched down and swept her prone form up into his arms in a single seamless movement. Melnia squeaked. Belatedly, she realized he was carrying her as one might a princess straight out of a storybook. Heat speared through her cheeks, but she didn't have the strength to protest. It was all she could do to keep herself awake after exerting herself so thoroughly. Can't bring you back like this, he muttered absently, keeping her from sweet sleep. Hold on a second. He retrieved his green cloak from the grass, gave it a shake, then draped it over her shoulders for modesty's sake. Melnia sputtered anew. She knew what it meant for a man drape their cloak over a woman, even from one demigod to another. To make matters worse, he even tied a little knot in the middle to hold said cloak together, accidentally embarrassing her all the more. There he grunted, satisfied with his handiwork. That'll do. Melnia made baffled Melnia noises. Did you just? There was nothing else she could say, nothing she could do but cling to him as he loped down the hill to face her army. More than a few cries went up at the sight of her. She could well imagine their shocking seeing her near naked and defeated, nestled in his arms, clinging onto him for fear of harm. She'd never felt so vulnerable in all her life. Maria's smirk when she saw her was unbearably smug. Melnia refused to look at her and instead focused her attentions upon the loyal men and women who had followed her here. The battle is over. Godric and I have reached terms. Lay down your arms. Maria wagged an eyebrow. Seems those terms ended with you face down in the mud. Melnia bit her lip and glared steadfastly at her army, silently willing her army to do the sensible thing. A discontented murmur passed through her warriors. Most of her clean-wrought knights obeyed, but the rank and file hesitated, glancing among themselves. That wouldn't do. She mustered her flagging energy and rallied as best she could. Lay down your weapons at once, I command thee. Kneel. A single word from Godric joined hers and rippled out among the masses in a shockwave. Most knelt on the spot. Others remained rooted where they stood, paralyzed by sheer bloody fear from his voice. Unless, of course, her Nefuno, the Lord of Stormvale, cracked his neck ominously. You'd prefer destined death. That can be arranged. Maria walked forward, blades drawn with a merry grin. Please resist. My sword isn't satisfied yet. Her words were the catalyst that sparked a mass surrender. Swords hit the grass. Axes tumbled to the floor. Shields clanked down. Daggers descended. Spears were moved into the mud. Someone moved suddenly. Melnia never really knew who, and just like that, they were bending the knee. Her army, a force 60,000 strong, knelt to them in a singular wave, passing from the vanguard to the army's flank. She couldn't be certain if the lot of them were kneeling to her, or Godric. She supposed it didn't matter. She was hardly in any shape to command anyone anymore. Really, it was a miracle they'd obeyed her at all. Great. Godric hummed his approval. All's well that ends well. Now let's. Melnia felt herself slipping. Keeping her eyes open was a battle, one she found herself losing. Oh, she tried to listen and stay awake, mind you, but after the day she'd had, she just couldn't be arsed with this anymore. Freed from the stresses of command at last, her body finally failed her. She slumped in Godric's arms and blacked out. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. A reference. Kneel, interlude. Not all were so accommodating toward male Nia. It was a hurdle to be expected naturally, Naruto knew. After all, only yesterday she'd been their sworn enemy, a foe determined to destroy him at any and all costs. If she'd had her way, Stormvale would have been a pile of rubble while her army trampled over his and put everything to the torch. Again, if she'd had her way. But she hadn't now, had she? Life loves her little games. Rather than the triumphant Scarlet Valkyrie she should have been, now male Nia lay in bed, sound asleep, a beaten and battered cripple placed under heavy guard by Maria herself. Dangerous perhaps, given she still held her left arm, but so long as they stayed out of their reach they were quite safe. Not that she would attack them, mind you. Even if this were some elaborate ruse on her part, unlikely, you couldn't fake the kind of emotional agony he'd seen, and she had duplicitous plans. She was an amputee in all but name. Down to a single arm with no legs to speak of, she could hardly flee the castle even if she were to attack anyone, and if she did, Maria would dispatch her quickly. His aunt wouldn't be able to put up much of a fight. After all, he devoured and destroyed the rot within Melinia's body, consuming the very essence of an outer goddess in the process. Which actually might make male Nia stronger in the long run, come to think of it. If she healed. Scary thought that. Not stronger than him, of course, but stronger than she had been. Still, he had shown mercy at the end, even if he wasn't entirely sure she deserved it. Didn't she? Her own brother, her twin, her very flesh and blood, that one person who should have been with her through thick and thin, had forsaken her. Abandoned her in all but name. Miquella had practically thrown his sister to the dogs in a desperate attempt to destroy both him and Limgrave. And what was that bit about her not being the first male Nia? No, he had questions for her, and she would remain his guest in Stormvale for the time being. Which brought him full circle to more personal matters. I won't accept that woman. Do not ask me to. Naruto heaved a sigh. Yorshika, do not Yorshika me, my lord. Her tail lashed at the ground as she stamped a foot and glared at him, all but pinning him up against a wall in the hall with one hand, which really said something for her ire, given how tall he was compared to her. She cornered him while he was on his way to speak with male Nia, and the moment she learned of his intentions, she wasn't having it. You cannot be serious. You're sparing her. She was your enemy. He did not expect his shadow to be so opposed to the idea. Maria, yes, and she'd eventually come right round, but Yorshika. Troublesome she was. He held up a finger to forestall another argument. She was betrayed, just like me, and she's seen the error of her ways. That's reason enough to spare her. The draconic half-breed looked like she wanted to bite something, but she restrained herself, if only just. She's a one-armed cripple, for crying out loud. If she doesn't grow her limbs back, Hugh can forge her new ones, he reasoned. And a proper sword. If anyone can do that, it's him. And then what? She stepped back and planted both fists on her hips, the most defiant she'd ever been. We let her and her army go on their merry way. Is that it? What happens when they decided to turn around and try their luck again? What will you do then? He shook his head and turned away, shouldering past her. She won't. Yorshika seized at his sleeve. But if she does? His temper sparked. Then I lop off her head and mount it on a spike outside the castle gates. His voice peaked in anger as his emotions briefly slipped their leash. What else do you want me to say? Her own brother turned on her right in front of me, and she was crying and begging for help. I couldn't just ignore her it the same way you couldn't ignore Fortisax. That may well be, but I must ask. Yorshika winced, but rallied, crossed both arms before her bountiful bosom, and stared at him in return. Has your resolve faltered, my lord? Do you intend to show mercy to the rest of your tormentors, as you have her? The words were a knife in his gut. Was she really losing faith in him? Over something like this? She was his shadow. Was she supposed to have his back? An ugly feeling stirred in him, and he buried it deep. It hasn't. He shook his head at last, refusing to falter under her glare. And I won't. Miquella will die. As will Rykard, Radagon, Marika, and everyone else who forsook us. Her full lips pursed. What of Runni? He shrugged a shoulder. I'll ask that silly girl when I track her down. Likewise, Radon and Godwin will decide their own fates when I find them. That seemed to mollify her somewhat, but nowhere near as much as he would have liked. Shaking her head, she smacked his leg with her tail and stalked off. Your kindness will come back to bite us. Mark my words. Naruto watched her go, shaking his head. She'd cool off, given time. Everything ached. Melnia creaked an eye open. Mistakes Mir made, they were many, and they were hers. The moment she tried to rise, she became terribly, horribly aware of her missing prosthetics and flopped back down to the bed in a heap. Confusion flitted through her mind, but only for a moment. She dearly didn't want to remember, but she did, and in remembering, realized where she was. A quick glance for her surroundings only confirmed her fears. Her room was a humble one, consisting of little more than 4 walls, a FL curing candle mounted by the windowsill, and the soft downy bed upon which she found herself splayed. But where in blazes had this frilly white bedgown come from? She'd been next to naked before with naught but Godric's cloak draped over her. His cloak. But then that would mean she was still pondering that when she looked over and saw a small child leaning over her beside, grinning ear to ear. Hello, Grand Auntie Melnia blinked. She blinked strong. Who is this small sassy child? That would be Teresa, your jailer. An eerily familiar voice chimed just out of sight. Do be kind to her. She groaned and covered her eyes with her remaining hand, wanting nothing more than to sleep. Why is she calling me her grandauntie? I've never seen her before. He brow furrowed and she took her hand away from her eyes. Does Godric have a daughter? He does not, and yet he does. The little one chirped happily. Which makes you my Grandaunt? Melnia stared at the ceiling and pointedly refused to look at this baffling child. I'm afraid I don't follow. Roll with it. Melnia didn't want to look at the other speaker. In the end, her wants proved immaterial. Her eyes betrayed her. I dressed you while you were asleep. Sure enough, Maria beamed back at her with a smug smirk, leaning against the door. I hope you don't mind. And yes, by the way, you were defeated. Her face fell. It wasn't a dream, Mahan. It most assuredly was not. The lady of the astral clock tower chided her. I don't think I've seen someone lose so spectacularly before. And oh, how that made her face burn. But what happened to you at the end there? That, at least, was no doing of ours. Her pale face creased with pity. I know what it is to be betrayed by one you called kin. Melnia found herself feeling somewhat conflicted at that. On one hand, she was somewhat grateful to be alive. On the other, Miquella. Dearest Miquella. He had betrayed her. That hurt. It hurt, it hurt, it hurt so much so that she wanted nothing more than to cry, curl into A and die. It would have been less painful had he torn her heart out and stamped on it. At least then she would be dead. But no, she had to live this. The knowledge. The pain. The misery. Why had he turned on her? Why would he do such a thing? It didn't make a LCK of sense, and in trying to understand she only twisted his thoughts into angry red knots. She wanted to chase after him, to find him, to demand answers, but she was in no shape to do so. She'd never been weaker than she was now, and they all knew it. She was, in a word, helpless. Trying to sit up again, she faltered. Then the door creaked open and a towering figure ducked their way into the room. Teresa beamed at him. Maria bowed her head in naked deference to her lord. Melnia recognized them at once, and her throat went horridly dry. You're awake? Godric rumbled at her with approval. Good. He sat at her beside, causing it to creak beneath him. You'd best start talking now, Aunt, and do it fast. Malini froze, pinioned by that stern stare. There could be only one response. She squeaked. Godric quirked a pale eyebrow at her. Right, she couldn't just lay here, could she? She dragged herself upright as best she could. And knelt to him. Snake, am I? Perhaps you'd like to see how serpentine I can be. A reference. In shadow we rise ever onto the next battle. The dawn came, and with it, plans for the revolution dawned anew. Gathered around the round table, his forces arrayed to make their next move. Naruto wished he could say it proved simple. It was not by any measure. What's our plan of attack? Do we hunker down here in Storm Vale? We can't move on the capital, we haven't the forces for it. Radon is currently besieging Morgott in Lendl. Should we ally with him? Preposterous, he's an enemy, then we must take his head, can't we all just get along? So many dissenting voices. Naruto pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled deeply. If you're all quite done. Maria drove the hilt of her blade into the table for silence. Hush, our lord speaks, attend to his wisdom. Heat crawled up the back of his neck. Why did she have to phrase it like that? So embarrassing. He looked out amongst them. His blade remained ever by his side, while Fortisax had laid claim to a corner of the room for himself. His vast bulk took up a great deal of space. For reasons he couldn't fathom, the ancient dragon was either unable or unwilling to assume human form. Instead, they'd made a crude window of sorts for him to stick his long neck in, bringing his snout just short of the table. Little Teresa was currently giving him the mother of all chin scratches. Truly, the tiny tree spirit child seemed to delight in the sight of him. Judging by the sullen snort he made, the W wasn't much pleased. What is our next move, heir of Godwin? He blew out a sigh. I told you, just call me Godric, and that was the question, wasn't it? Maria was eager to take the offensive, such was her nature. Fortisax favored a more measured approach. Time meant little to him in the long run. Yorshka had not a word to say to him. She was still sulking after their quarrel over Malnia, and speak of the devil and she shall arrive. Apologies for our lateness. Alexander trundled in loudly, bearing the demigod herself in his arms, body bedecked in a rich green dress as she clung to him for dear life. Our new comrade needed proper attire, which was rather difficult given she only has one arm at the moment, but here we are. Malenia's face was redder than her hair. I told you I didn't need a dress. Nonsense, he boomed. A lady must always be dressed properly. His aunt made angry ant noises, the amusement of many. Naruto stifled a laugh behind his hand. That jolly jar warrior really was too pure for his own good. It's no trouble, none at all. Yorshka leaned forward to hiss at the redhead as Alexander lowered her into a chair. You may have a seat at this table, but you are not granted a rank among this council. You are far from our equal. Malenia looked like she wanted to bite back at that, to say something nasty to that effect, but she held herself back. He saw it in the twitch of her eye, the vein throbbing in her temple. Yet for all that she smiled, even if it was a restrained one, she did not go berserk. Was she trying to impress him? Prove she could change, perhaps. Be better. It was plausible, and if so, she was doing a good job. An admirable job. He'd give her the benefit of the doubt for now. Miquella had well and truly betrayed her, leaving her with nothing. Now that he'd slain the scarlet rot within her, her fate was her own. He was curious to see what she would suggest. And what do you suggest we do, dear aunt? Malenia tensed, painfully aware of all eyes upon her. She knew he was putting on airs, but she was powerless to call him on it. A shame. He wasn't used to seeing her so subdued. Miquella had broken more than her body, it seemed. He'd sittered her spirit. He couldn't blame her for being loyal even now. After all, he was her twin. Miquella must die. A sudden hush fell over the table. Naruto's brow shot up into his hair. Color me surprised. Why suggest this? He took control of my body and my mind, and I failed to realize it until he cast me aside. Wobbling a little in her chair, she set her remaining arm on the table for balance, sparing Alexander a grateful glance as he kept her steady. Miquella is the most dangerous Empyrean of us all. He uses love to shrive clean the hearts of his foes, leaving them loyal to him and him alone. He must be stopped. Agreed. Alexander thumped an iron fist upon the table. Such a rogue cannot be allowed to wander the lands between. I concur. Fortisax rumbled after only a moment's pause. If nothing else, he may know a way to revive Godwin. Maria's grin was feral. Then it is settled. Kurama perked up, claiming his attention as the conversation ranged on. Do you hear that? Destined death called to him suddenly, singing in his soul like a clarion call, and with it the distant tremor of wings on the air. He held up a hand, bringing the bickering to a halt. There's been a raven. Malenia squinted at him. What? How did you know, my lord? The chamber door swung open, admitting a harried hooded page, holding a message scroll letter, technically in his offhand. A message for you, a letter. He quirked a brow at the rolled scroll. Whoever could it be from? All eyes turned toward him, demigod and dragon and human alike. All right, that was rude of me. I'll read it later in my study. They kept staring. Teresa tugged at his sleeve insistently. When had she gotten round the table? Or I could read it now. Breaking the seal, it held a crest he didn't recognize. He unfurled the letter in its entirety and began to read it aloud. Dearest nephew, or should I say cousin? It's strong to tell. Relations in our families have ever been murky, I suppose. Regardless, I pray this letter finds you well. My sister has spared no expense to write to me in the realm of shadows. I thank you for keeping her in good spirits during these trying times, and in return, I bring thee an offer of assistance. You have allies, even here in the land of shadow. Know that there are those who hate Marika just as much thee. My lord would happily join your cause. You have but to free him from his burden. I am told you can do such, O bearer of destined death. Contained within this letter is a means to access our realm. The rest I leave to you. But beware. You are not the only one who has taken an interest in this place. Please, release my love from his thankless task. Convince him to leave, and our armies will be yours. I ask for your most timely correspondence in this delicate matter. Ever your ally, Relana, sort of Mesmer. He set the letter down and idly noticed a small, wrapped parcel within, concealed within layers of deep dark blue cloth. Pulling back the layers of rich velvet, a key, black as night, carved from a small fragment of destined death. Another reminder. He really needed to track Mr. Malekith down and have a word with him. But that was neither here nor there. He plucked the key up and held it aloft. I'll be right back. Maria frowned. It's clearly a trap. I know of no Relana in the histories of Korea. Likely because she was wiped from them. He closed the scroll, idly clutching the key in his offhand. Marika always hid that which she didn't like, and I trust Renala. She has no reason to betray us. And if it is a trap. He looked her way, bemused. Then I'll spring it and crush the one responsible. Male Nia made a dissatisfied noise from across the table. I would render you my aid, but I'm quite powerless as I am now. Svine, he waved a hand her way. Your limbs probably aren't going to grow back anytime soon, if at all. I'll have Hugh fashion you some limbs in the meantime. Do you longing a particular metal? Black will do. She dug her good hand into the table with a growl. I am no longer of unalloyed gold, no matter what anyone says. Yorshka pointedly looked away with a huff. We shall see. Things would come to a head between them sooner or later, but not today. Perhaps there is a remnant of my Lord Godwin's soul in this place. Fortisax dared to sound hopeful. Poor lizard. He didn't have the heart to correct the old dragon. Godwin was gone. Whether by accident or design, he very much doubted he'd find any semblance of his so-called sire in the land of shadows. Of course, he wasn't about to say that. Wouldn't do to wound the old WM even further. I will accompany you. And now they came to the next obstacle. Maria, she set her jaw and glared at him. This is not a matter for discussion. You're right, it's not. He drew his green cloak back and leaned against his golden axe. I need you here in case anyone attacks while I'm away. You and Fortisax are our heavy hitters. If we all leave at once, the castle will be vulnerable, to say nothing of the town and those we've sworn to protect. I don't care about them, I care about you. And I love that, he smiled for her, but my decision is final. She looked like she might protest at that. He didn't give her the chance. He slammed Relana's key into the air and fell backward. The air twisted. Mesmer heard it before he saw it. An ominous creaking, wailing sound as the very fabric of reality was sundered against its will. He knew that sound. It was not a noise one could easily forget, an awful cacophony he had only ever heard once before. Curious, he creaked an eye open atop his throne and leaned forward, peering into the gloom. A wave of his hand lit the candles therein. The pale, grinning visage of a young man gazed back at him, grinning from ear to ear. It was not a nice smile. Salutations, Uncle, care for another crusade. Mesmer fell out his chair. Could not be killed, and they had tried was to be avoided at all costs. Perhaps that was why his kin avoided.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.